Hello and welcome to EXP Required, a podcast where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. I'm Jack, and as always, joined by Mol. How you doing, Mol? You all right?
Hello, yes, not too bad, thank you. Once again, the weather has picked up, so I'm nice and hot and melty. English summer, huh?
Everyone that listens to this podcast, especially if they live in the States, is going to be like, oh, I bet the weather in the UK is really good. Because every time we start this podcast, we're like, it's so warm. And it's not
It's a
like this,
complete
guys. This
anomaly.
is just like we don't even choose to record on hot days. It just happens. This is our summer. Like every episode you hear us recording that's the entire summer. I'm waiting to the next
Stuck
few
inside
episodes.
talking about video games like every other summer that I've ever had.
That is the theme of my, certainly my childhood summers. Yeah. What have you been up to in the interim?
That's a good question. What have I
Cooling
been up
down.
to? Doing my best to cool down. Yeah. I've been playing a little bit more Elden Ring, started a new game with a friend in a co-op mod, and the first tier of the 8-man raid series for Final Fantasy XIV's Dawn Trail came out at time of recording less than a week ago.
And
sometime around a week or so
and
ago.
You've only slept twice since then, I take it. I actually have started. I say started. I put Final Fantasy XIV on for half an hour. I have started to dip my toe into Final Fantasy XIV.
Ooh, dangerous ground, my friend.
Yeah, it was mainly to get footage for that video on Triple Triad, which I realized, oh my god, it's going to take me about 30 hours before I can play Triple Triad in this game.
It's interesting that you mentioned Triple Triad, because I've actually decided that I'm going to start collecting the cards in earnest in 14 for the first time. It's taking forever. There are some card drops that are like a less than 1% chance, and they're driving me crazy.
It's probably easier than in real life trying to collect like Pokemon cards that have like...
Oh god, yeah, absolutely. At least if I really want them in real life, I can take them out of someone else's hands. I can't do that in the game. They just refuse.
That makes you sound like you're a thief. Like, I'm just going to go up to some poor child and go, I'm having that now, it's mine.
At least I don't have an axe in real life.
Anyway, right. So we're going to talk about a game today, which is Final Fantasy XVI, which has a theme of fire. So it fits the ambience, doesn't it?
It does.
Of this red hot... I mean, I was watching videos earlier of Ifrit, as it's called. And I just thought, this feels like, I could feel the energy off it because of how red hot it is outside.
You know what? I've been giving it some thought, Jack, and I'm going to be nice to you. I'm not doing a Ben Starr counter this episode. I don't think that would be fair.
Well, you mentioned his name first, so yeah, he's going to be mentioned a fair bit. Though, interestingly, but this is a teaser for later on, Ben Starr, brilliant, but Clive is not my favourite character in the game. So, yeah. But anyway, so Final Fantasy XVI, probably less of a spiel to start with this one because it's so new. So it's not like we're going to be like, oh, this was released in the annals of time 25 years ago. So this was released on PS5 on June the 22nd, 2023, which at time of recording is just over a year, 14 months ago.
It feels like both the longest time and no time at all since then, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's definitely one of those things that has been impactful regardless of what one thinks of it. Anyway, so it's developed by the Creative Business Unit 3, or III, at Square Enix, which includes a lot of veterans from the Ivalice universe and Final Fantasy XIV, which is so obvious if you play this game.
It's very obvious, especially if you came from Final Fantasy XIV. There are so many little things in the UI and even in the soundtrack that multiple points made me be like, this is the same game. This is the same fucking game. So the only real member of the development team that I have a particular note on is the writer for Final Fantasy XVI scenario, or at least the lead writer, a man by the name of Kazutoyo Maehiro. He was also the, I believe, lead writer for the first expansion for Final Fantasy XIV, Heavensward. And I feel like this is something that I'm going to be saying a lot throughout this entire episode. There are so many little similarities between 14 and 16, which kind of make them not married together in a way that, say, 12 and Tactics are. But there are definitely little story beats from here and there where you go, yes, this is definitely the same person that wrote Heavensward. Everything with Shiva felt like it was everything with Shiva in 14 again, just slightly to the left this time.
Intriguing. I mean, obviously, I've picked up Final Fantasy XIV for research purposes very recently. I've never really been an online gamer. I'm such an obsessive person that I can't stop. So I think if I limit myself somewhat,
I
it helps me.
completely understand. I checked my my subscription time today for Final Fantasy XIV, and apparently I've been playing it 7.5 years. I didn't realize it had been that long. Double check the dates. Apparently the website is correct. Yeah, completely feel you on that
7.5 years real time, right?
Real time, yeah.
It's a long time. Anyway, so the story, very briefly, is Final Fantasy XVI is set in the twin continents of Valisthea, currently divided between 6 nations who hold power through access to magical crystals, and dominance, humans who act as hosts for each nation's icon. Tensions between the nations escalate as magical drought, dubbed the Blight, begins consuming the land. Clive Rossfield, guardian to his younger brother Joshua, witnesses his kingdom destroyed and becomes involved in the growing conflict between Valistia's nations and a secret power driving the war. Now, that's a pretty good setting. But the first question I've got for you, I'm going to brace myself now, is what did you think of this game?
Ooh, how long have you got, Jack?
You go first. You go first.
So 16 is a very interesting title for me. I went into it very excited because obviously it's been 10 years since the last properly numbered Final Fantasy. Previously it was 15. That came out in 2016, I believe.
Right, yep.
So, you know, it's been some time since we had a numbered main title, and I didn't really know what to expect going in. I was kind of making a whole journey of it last year. I flew out to America to visit some friends for a month, and they very generously waited a week since 16 actually dropped so that I could be there with them and we could all play together rather than them doing the prologue nice. And then starting. Yeah, it was a really nice experience. And it was definitely a unique experience of going through something for the first time with other people as opposed to on my own and then coming back and talking about it with other people afterwards. Now, we came out of it with very different opinions, shall I say. It's definitely a title that I think is worthy of the Final Fantasy name. Do I think it's the best? No. Do I think it's the worst? No. I didn't enjoy 16, but I did so despite my trying very, very hard to do so. I really put a lot of legwork in trying my best to ignore the little things that were bothering me. And by the end of it, I just could not do it. I think overall, I ended up rating 16 probably a 4 out of 10 overall.
That's interesting.
I was being as kind as I could. And it's a shame because there is a lot of good things to like about this game. There's a lot that it tried and, you know, not necessarily failed or succeeded at doing, but it, as we've discussed before, it did the Final Fantasy thing of trying something new. And I will absolutely commend it and respect it for that.
So, I'll point out that this was well received critically, though quite polarizing within the fan base due to its more action-oriented combat more than anything. I mean, was that the thing that...
No, the combat was not an issue for me whatsoever.
That's interesting. Well, that's interesting. Well, I'll give my quick spiel and then we'll get into the...
By all means.
This is going to be a really interesting structure, this one, because there's so much to this title. So I actually... So here's an interesting thing for me with Final Fantasy. So I didn't realize this till I bought Final Fantasy 16. I didn't get a PS5 until this game. So that was last year. And the same thing happened to me with Final Fantasy 15, and I got a PS4 off the back of Final Fantasy 15. And the same thing happened to me with the PS3. I got a PS3 off the back of Final Fantasy 13.
Right.
Now, both of those titles I didn't really get on with initially.
I remember you saying that before, yeah.
Whereas this one I did. Now, I think what's interesting for me, I think it might be on an honest trailer somewhere where someone reviews The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman movie.
Okay,
and they said it's a movie you'll really enjoy while you're watching it, and then it will annoy you a lot afterwards. Right. So when I finished this game last year, I thought, this is my game of the year. This is fantastic. But as I thought about it a little bit more, I actually came to think not so much. Might be because I played some more games, but also like, I would call this game a beautiful mess.
I think that's probably a very good descriptor of it, actually.
Which is interesting because there's some really, really, really good moments about this game. Mm-hmm. And I think probably the thing that appeals to me with the game is probably more its influence and its impact. Because, I mean, you kind of alluded to it there with your experience of it. We've mentioned Ben Starr. So Ben Starr obviously has come to prominence within the games industry through this game. He's obviously an actor that's been acting in other stuff for some time, so he's not a stranger to fame, should we say. It's not like he's just come out of nowhere. But obviously through his experience playing Clive Rossfield in this game, the lead character, it's come out that he's not only a video game fan, but he's a Final Fantasy fan as well. It's almost like he's the ultimate person to have starred as a Final Fantasy character in a game. And what he's done through his, I don't even call it, like his kind of like...
Community outreach?
Community outreach, his way of communicating with the fan base. It's just been... I think it's eclipsed the game. I think that in itself is kind of... It's difficult to separate that from Final Fantasy 16, I think.
Yeah.
For me. And also, I think that extends to the cast of Final Fantasy 16 being predominantly a British cast, even if they're not all British born, they are British speaking and stuff like that. And it is a very British feeling game with its architecture and its setting. Obviously, it's influenced very heavily by Game of Thrones, which is obviously a very English, British, historically influenced thing. Obviously, we've talked in the past about the medieval fantasy stuff within other Final Fantasy games is very European, but this is the first one where I really think, you know what, this is Britain. This is like this looks like a a castle I've walked past on a walk or something like that. This looks the same. I mean, not quite the same because there's no like, men at arms living in it and people drinking in it like it is a real castle. Only at the weekends.
Oh, I'm sure there's some youths in Valisthea that are drinking behind the castles. Don't you worry, Jack.
Well, no. What I mean is like in real life, it's not like I've gone back in time and I'm actually like, just for anyone that's listening in America, we don't actually live in castles. It's like, but you do see that kind of architecture around. So I think there's like this like heart over head feeling about this game.
No, I completely agree with you, actually, especially since not so much now, a year after the game's release, and which is something that I can completely understand. It's been a year since the game out. Everyone that's worked on it has, well, they've had to move on to different things. That's kind of the nature of their work. But definitely in the early days, the first half year or so, most of the voice cast was very, very active on specifically Twitter that I'm aware of. They were very, very welcoming to the fans. They were very open to discussing things with them, to answering questions on, I believe the website's called Cameo, where you can call in to request birthday messages and the like. And overall, it was really, really nice to see them interacting so warm-heartedly with the fans. I know there's definitely been an uptick in discussion in the last 5-10 years or so about how much development teams and people that actually work on things should really be involved with the actual people that consume them. But in this case, I'm more than fine with it because they really seemed to embrace their roles and really, really love what they did, which is always such a nice thing to see. Even if I didn't like the end result, to know that the people that worked on it had a good time and really liked what they did, I think is worth so much more than what my end opinion was.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It makes the game greater as opposed to better, doesn't it? Obviously, I've got a different opinion. I like this game quite a lot. It's not in my top 5 Final Fantasy games. It's interesting because you said that it wasn't the combat for you that put you off, but it put a lot of people off. But actually, that probably helped me a bit because I love Devil May Cry so much. I thought I would be more annoyed by that element of it than not. You know what I mean? But so I guess what we'll do is we'll talk about the sections as we normally do. We'll talk about the story and then we can jump in with what our thoughts on certain things are. And then we'll pick out the bits that you did like, we didn't like. And I will rant about the parts that work because parts of it I loved, parts of it I really, really hated. There's no middle ground.
No, I definitely felt like that for a good chunk of the game as well. There are parts that were very, very high. There were parts that were very, very low.
Yes.
There were very few parts that were completely middle ground.
Yeah,
and what
that's
parts
fair.
there were completely forgettable to me. So I don't really know if I can even really count them.
We talked about Valisthea, which is the world of Final Fantasy XVI. Again, very British. One thing I did notice while playing this, obviously having played Tactics recently, is that the map setup is very, very similar to Tactics.
Yes.
I thought actually, in a way, quite liked that setup. You could actually choose where you appeared on the map and then move around it. I quite thought that was quite an interesting story development. It certainly worked very well for the way that they told the story in this game.
Yeah, I thought so as well. I know there was a point very, very early on in the beginning, I think when I first saw the world map and all the points and realizing like, okay, this is how it's going to be set up, where I was a little sad that we weren't going to get like the traditional world map of being able to traverse towards places. But I think that probably would have been far too open world considering the scope of a lot of the places that we did actually visit. I know a lot of them were fairly linear, for example, the Deepwood, and having to just, you're going from point A to B and it's a story plot, that's fine. I don't really mind linear walkways too much, but considering the scope of the world and the depth that they tried to make each individual area, if they had expanded that to be a full world, I think that would have killed it.
Totally. I mean, I could pretty much 100% agree with that. I think I was exactly the same when I first saw it. I was a bit like, oh, is this the way it's going to be? But actually, in order to create what I think I will notice with this is that there's a bit of a sprawling shades of grey storyline in this, which we've alluded to is like Game of Thrones. I don't think it ends up being quite like Game of Thrones because it does become good versus evil at the end. Spoiler, by the way, there will be spoilers for this game if you're listening. I can't talk about this without talking about spoilers because it's so that there's so many sprawling parts of the narrative, so many different characters involved that I genuinely, other than the major story beats, could not tell you what happened when. Because it's like, I mean, I tried to come up with maybe a summary of what happens in this game, and it's like, well, okay, I understand the characters' motives, I understand who's who, I understand who's sleeping with who's killing who's related to who's gonna stab someone through the chest with a spear to who, and all that sort of stuff. I don't know when it happens and why it happens. It's not. I think that's not fair to throw at this game because that's probably akin to this kind of storytelling, which the Game of Thrones HBO series is really created now in television and now as an extension within the game. Is actually, as long as you understand what the characters' motives are, you can follow it. But it certainly was ambitious, and I think it was pretty good in how it how it went about doing it. Because as long as you tune into that and go, you know what, actually, I'm going to stop remembering who's related to who and what the name of the place is. I'm just going to think that person there, I know what they want, and then go from there. So that's my take on that side of it anyway.
So it's and once again, to reiterate, there are going to be spoilers. I'm going to be naming the final boss very, very shortly. If you do not want to hear spoilers for this episode,
his name is Wanker Face. Yeah.
Yeah, dear old Wanker Face, WF as I like to call him. So I notice, obviously, that you've now mentioned the Game of Thrones influence quite a lot, and that's something that I'm actually going to disagree with right off the bat. Yes. So I don't know how much of the development team and their interests you're actually aware of, particularly.
Not particularly.
Honestly, same here. Despite them, creating a video game I've spent 7.5 years playing, I don't really know too much about them as individual people, which for me is perfectly fine. I don't really want to know about them as individual people. However, I do know that they are all very big fans of the Evilist Alliance.
That's clear as well. Yeah.
That's the thing. It got to a point pretty early on, actually, post playing 16 and seeing what other people were thinking and saying, I was getting really sick of the Game of Thrones comparison. To me, it's so much less a Game of Thrones parallel than an Evilist attempt. And I say attempt rather than parallel, because to me, it isn't that they wanted to create the next big Game of Thrones. I think the reason that we've been calling it that is because Game of Thrones is so much more, well, it's a very obvious parallel to make it as the big thing over in the West, at the very least, for years, even if, the ending did make people's enjoyment of it die off and stop talking about it. However, for me personally, rather than a Game of Thrones influence, it was so much more of an Evilist influence because of all of the people that worked on the team and how they enjoyed it. For me, they failed at making it be the next Evilist. And for me, the most obvious thing here is the big bad of the game. Ultima should have been a woman. This is
okay. That's interesting.
This is the baseline of every Evilist game. Ultima has always been a woman,
right? Gotcha.
And to miss that is kind of it feels to me almost as if they then missed the underlying core of what Evilist means. They should have done something very, very different, in my opinion. With the final boss.
Interesting. That's interesting. Two threads with that. So the Game of Thrones side of stuff, I think, that's obviously what a lot of the media around the game has said. The Game of Thrones, I think the Game of Thrones influence, I think, comes from the way the story is set up at the beginning. Because, and again, maybe because of the influences are similar. And we mentioned in the tactics episode that I made a few Game of Thrones parallels there, and I think I used the analogy that it was influenced by the same things. There's the British medieval history and the tropes of, in some respects. For example, Game of Thrones, Jon Snow with his pet wolf. That happens in this. You've got the Clive and his pet wolf. I think that's probably an allegory to Game of Thrones in some way, even if it's just a nod to it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. By all means, I don't think it's completely devoid of Game of Thrones influence.
But what's interesting about the comparison between, say, like Jon Snow as a character in Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire and Clive Rossfield in Final Fantasy 16 is, to me, they're more like both like a King Arthur archetype. Both of them probably directly or indirectly come from that archetype of being, the character that starts off as, you don't know that again, spoilers for Game of Thrones potentially, is that they are not important, quote unquote, but actually they might be the heir to the throne, or they might be the important chosen one. It's that King Arthur archetype. So I think it's difficult to unpick the direct influences from the source material, the wolf side of stuff, the general fact that probably there was an influence in terms of let's make a more medieval story because medieval stories are popular, type thing, from the fact they both share similar influences. And obviously Evilist is influenced by very similar influences to Game of Thrones as well. So that's probably a lot of it. And it's difficult. It's probably quite lazy to be, so just because it's Game of Thrones. I agree with you in that sense. It's
it also all comes down to that whole idea of, well, there is no more original stories. We're all just picking and choosing single threads from other things that have been done 1,000 times before at this point.
Exactly. And there are only so many stories that you can tell. But I think it's quite interesting your point about Ultima, because obviously you're more close to Evilist than I am. What I liked about Ultima, because I didn't like Ultima's design, it made me sick, to be honest with you.
I didn't mind the initial design. The final design I didn't really care for.
Like, when I say made me sick, I was like, you look so ugly, man. It's just like
he does look like he needs a sandwich or three, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's like, what's interesting is what I did like about Ultima in one sense was, because I'm torn with Ultima, like he was as well, because his legs were torn off, it appeared, is that I didn't like his design. But what I did like is that Ultima kind of exists in a parallel world, and then, is pulling the strings and then you fight Ultima at the end. Now, what I thought was the interesting parallel there was that at the end, the spoilers for Final Fantasy IX, by the way, is Necron in Final Fantasy IX. Right at the end of the game, Kuja destroys the crystal, and then all of a sudden there's this bad guy that comes out of nowhere called Necron that wants to pull everything back to the Zero World. And everyone's like, what the fuck is that about? Like, and pretty much even Final Fantasy IX, massive fans, which I'm one of, are like, that's a bit of shit. I think that it was interesting that I think if they'd made, in Final Fantasy IX, they'd made Necron be more like the way Ultima's served up in this game, i.e. that there's a thread. I mean, you do a little bit of a thread of the Terran architecture in Final Fantasy IX that is akin to Necron, and you kind of like, it's not a complete surprise, but I think if they'd done that, you know, you see glimpses of Necron appear a bit more throughout the game, quite how they did with Ultima here. That makes sense. So it's more how Ultima was served up I quite liked.
I'll agree with that, actually, especially with the parallel to 9 as well. And I don't think it can really be understated that there's at least something of a similar silhouette between Ultima and Necron as well.
Yes.
So I think that is a good parallel to draw on. Yeah, that definitely did come out of nowhere. And again, to this day, confuses even me, or not necessarily confuses, but my plus is rather nonned with it, if you get my meaning. But Ultima, I think for as much as I dislike Ultima's role within the story, I suppose, I'm fine with the foreshadowing.
Have you seen Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood?
I have not. No, it is on my to watch list.
If you've seen that, you'll feel parallels in this story. It felt very much like that. There's obviously, like, without getting any spoiler heavy on that, there's an element of brotherly storyline which you get in this game between Clive and his brother Joshua. Ultima, maybe not directly, but certainly feels a bit more like that other world. There's a little otherworldly stuff going on in that story. And what's served up in that story, quite interestingly, is that it is overt from the beginning that there's more going on in the politics of the world. It seems to be set up very similar to that. And obviously, like, Full Metal Alchemist is a Square Enix product because it was written or published by Enix. So I think
wasn't it?
There may be
everywhere.
There may be some parallels with the story. Maybe they've been influenced by that, but they certainly felt the way it was served up is it was not a secret that Ultima was pulling the strings early on. You know what I mean? Whereas the rest of the characters in the game were very much like, you know, political pawns, but they didn't view themselves as political pawns. They felt like they were doing the right thing for themselves. And there's almost like Clive's being like, there's an existential threat, we need to deal with it, blah, 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 blah. That's kind of the vibe. And that's sort of similar to Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, probably less as overt as that, but it kind of felt similar to me in that sense. Again, yeah, I'm not completely enamored by Ultima as a big bad. I think Ultima didn't have enough of a personality for me compared to someone like, we talked about Final Fantasy IX, and I'm going to do it again. Kuja in that story had a similar setup in a sense that he was creating havoc throughout the Mist continent, very much the same way that havoc was created through the world here. But Kuja had a personality, and Kuja was a very attractive man as well.
Oh, yes.
You know what I mean? Like, he was very cool to look at, and you could identify with him on some level. Ultima is just a monster. And I don't know whether that's the vibe that we're going for. We aren't supposed to relate to Ultima because he's, you know, this kind of like
unknowable and
potentially
being, from a different planet.
Don't really like villains like that too much, if I'm totally honest with you. I think it's better when you have a villain that you can in some ways empathize with, even if you don't believe in their methods or even their goal. If you can humanize them in some way, so you can at least see their perspective and challenge them on it. Whereas Ultima, it's almost like, I'm going to kill everyone, and I'm going to turn you into my slave. And it was just like, okay, cool. It made it less personal.
No, I completely understand that. Can I fix Final Fantasy XVI for both of us with a single statement in that case?
Make Ultima sexy.
Ultima. God, that only just hit for me. I mean, maybe this next thing that I'm about to say is related to that then. Annabella should have been Ultima the entire time.
That would have been amazing.
There you go. I fixed Final Fantasy XVI.
That would have been absolutely amazing.
It would have fixed my gripe. It would have fixed your gripes. It would have worked, in my opinion. And it would have shifted Annabella's story to be a bit more palatable for me. And that's something that I'll get into at a later date, because boy, I've written some stuff down about everything.
We're getting into this now. Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's interesting because, I mean, I think Hartford said, let's go a bit more into some of the parallels and stuff, because there are some interesting themes. I mean, I think it's debatable how well some of them were done. I think in some senses this was half-baked, this game. That sounds awful. In some ways it was half-baked. I'm not going to try and criticize the way it was developed, because I think it was lovingly developed. I think that you know, I don't think there was any malice or bad intent or anything like that. But you have alluded to the fact this is very similar to Final Fantasy XIV. I'm not a big Final Fantasy XIV player, but I have played MMOs in the past. Now, what I found interesting about the design of this game, which kind of links on from the way the stories. I'm not talking about like the combat design. I'm talking about the way the quests and the sort of narrative plays through with you playing through the game, is that it did feel like an MMO. So you start off somewhat into the game where you become part of Sid's gang as Clive, and then you start moving around, collecting ingredients for people around Sid's little hideout, which feels like very much like MMO side quests. They're not big bombastic side quests that you would get, and they're not.
No, it very much is go here, pick up this thing.
Go here, pick up this thing. They're fetch quests, right? Now they are obviously in non-MMO games, but they are very prevalent in MMO games because the design of those games is trying to get you familiar with the area you're in and build it up in that way. I think that as a design choice, that was a good idea in this game. And I think it was implemented very, very well in some places, but in other places, it was really, really annoying.
I definitely agree with you, actually.
And that's the weakest part of the game is the side quests, because some of it was just like, I don't want to go and give a bag of potatoes to this other flipping kid when I'm like, I mean, it's not because I necessarily think that sort of act is beneath Clive, because obviously through the story, Clive takes on the mantle of Sid and becomes like a bit of a man of the people, shall we say. And I guess the vibe they were going for is that the man of the people still does, not so bombastic tasks for everyone. He helps them out with their day-to-day tasks. So I understand, but in a game, that works really well narratively. Is okay, he's one of the people, but in a game when there's only so many potatoes I can flip and pick, for God's sake. You know what I mean? I'd rather go outside and I wouldn't go outside and do that, but you know what I mean? Like, it's something that's like, I think it worked well towards the beginning when Clive was asserting himself and winning people over. And what I did like about Sid's hideout specifically is towards the beginning of the game, no one likes Clive apart from Sid. Yeah. They all think he's a bit of a a posh boy, and he is a posh boy. And then he shows his worth to everyone, and that you get that through him doing these little tasks. And I think if they changed the subquests a little bit further on to be a little bit less like that, I think it would have probably
a bit more with weight. Yeah. So what I've noted down here, and I'm sure this is something that you'll notice the more that you play 14, and then if you ever go back to 16 as well, the UI between them and the markers is so markedly similar that it was genuinely quite jarring for me. I believe the markers over characters' heads was actually like pretty much almost exactly the same. So it made it feel like CBU3 wanted to do a little nod back to what they've done before, which isn't a bad thing. But unfortunately, as a 14 player, I know that Final Fantasy 14 is what they've affectionately called a theme park before. It is so full of nods that it doesn't feel original anymore, I suppose. Like, I've seen them do the nods back 1,001 times, and seeing them do it again was like, okay, well, this is just kind of your MO at this point. Maybe that's a very minor nitpick to have, but it bothered me. Not to mention that some of the, and this is something I'm going to agree with you actually, the earlier side quests, they're a bit tedious, but they make sense narratively and for Clive to do. But some of them later on really broke the pacing for me as well. Yeah. They're completely optional. You don't have to do them, but some of them actually gave a lot back to the world as well. And having, say, the blacksmith's whole backstory behind his load of final quests when you're trying to save the world at this point, it really felt like it was like, this is taking too long, there's too many detours, and you're taking away from the main group now. And especially when it doesn't feel like you have a lot with the main group as it is, to then give some focus away from them and give it to people who, are important in the grand scheme of things to Clive and to the world, but not really as important as like your nearest and dearest. It bugged me, sure, but it also just felt like you've slowed the pace of the game down way too much.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So it's almost like they tried to turn an MMO into a non-MMO game. That's definitely really apparent from playing. I mean, obviously, before I'd really read into the history and played a little bit of Final Fantasy XIV, I didn't know the narrative similarities the design similarities. But when I was playing it, I thought this feels like an MMO, the way it's set up. And I think in some respects that kind of works, but also in an MMO, and certainly this is true of Final Fantasy XIV. I can say even without being an authority, is that it reinvents itself so many times, and you can write like a placeholder backstory for someone and then change it or expand upon it as time goes on. Here it feels like they sort of planned to do that and then didn't. So for example, there is a couple of side quests which I'm going to move on to now that did really impress me, because we mentioned Evilise and we mentioned Final Fantasy Tactics, and we talked in that episode about how the theme of that story was basically classism, and it was classism born of the common people, as they're called within these worlds. What would the phrase be? The sort of the people who went off to war and then came back and were let down by the aristocracy, and because people could view, hang on a minute, we're no different than these people. You had some members of the aristocracy siding with the common folk, and that's a parallel with history that happens, but there's a lot of classism going on where people believe they were innately better than other people because of where they were born. This game isn't about that. It's about slavery. They touched upon the slavery side of stuff. I think in some respects it was done well. There was one particular part it was done well in, which shocked me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Was it the Nobleman and the Dog's Quest?
Yeah, no, not that one. No, that one's. So there is a little place in the game, and it's probably, again, I don't remember when it is in the story. I think it's about third of the way into the game. It's the town's called Moor, and the story one you're talking about there's a man with dogs and stuff like that. But there is a side quest called Playthings, and you essentially go into this little racist town called Moor, and there's a little girl called Lizette who has lost her pet Chloe and is worried she won't be able to stroke her pretty white hair again.
Yes.
And the client eventually finds Chloe, and it's a bearer, which is basically a human, a magical slave. And the little girl is more annoyed that her plaything has died, and it's like, oh my god, like shocking. And of course, Clive gives a little speech about how Chloe was a person too, which like that was a jarring moment. I think, I don't know if artistic's the right word, because it wasn't pleasant to play through that area. It let you know that particular area of the game was a very nasty place with some not very nice people, but it wasn't enjoyable. So I think that was quite clever and quite ambitious. And then of course you go to another place 3 foot away, and it's like not like that at all. I mean, but that might be a parallel to real world and make it realistic, where actually, you know, something horrible's going on one place, and then 3 foot away it's actually pleasant and nice. So, you know, you could argue that actually it's realistic, but at the same time, it kind of made it a bit, like you say, the pacing felt a little off, and the themes felt a little bit jarring in that sense.
There are points where the look at the world overall, I suppose, it makes sense, and I have no qualms with it at all. You know, there are some bits which make me a little bit skeptical, I suppose, but I'm fine with suspending my disbelief. You know, the town where, I've forgotten the name of it, is it Northreach, where Isabella's brothel is kept?
Oh, yeah. That's nearby to Moor. I don't think it's far away from Moor. It's close by.
I have absolutely zero issues with including a brothel within the fantasy realm, but it did scream very strange to me that all of the sex workers there aren't persecuted or looked down upon. They're actually looked upon relatively favorably, and it's like, okay, I'm gonna suspend my disbelief of this, because this is kind of what I would prefer the world to be like anyway. But also in a world where you're really trying to knuckle down on just how terrible some people are, and you know, someone 10 foot over that way is going, oh, well, my fucking plaything is dead and I didn't really consider them a person. It's like, okay, well, where are you drawing the line then? It was a very, very strange thing to try and come to grips with. And it's this is, I think, probably going to be the best tie-in that I have to talk about this. And this is going to be probably a little uncomfortable to talk about at all. How much of the pre-release cycle were you paying attention to?
Not very much. A tiny bit retrospectively, that there was an event held at the Tower of London showing off the initial demo, and that was something that Ben Starr was at, and I know people that were there as well, content creators who, you know, have shared photos of that, and so I'm familiar with that from more of what we mentioned before about how the cast and the developers got involved with the public and things like that, but nothing other than that, really.
Okay, fair enough. So Naoki Yoshida, who is the director and producer of Final Fantasy XIV, and I think he's just the director for 16, or he might hold both titles again. I'm not actually 100% certain on that one. The man is very good at PR for the most part. And obviously leading up to the game, you're doing your interviews, you're trying to get people hyped up. Now, there was one interview that Yoshida did prior to the game's coming out. I don't know by how long. I think it was a few months. It wasn't a super long time, but it wasn't a very short time before either, which initially made me kind of stop in my tracks and then go, hang on, do I actually want to play this game?
Okay.
Now, I have this quote almost in full. There was a small part which wasn't relevant, so I've cut that out. But what Yoshida's words were translated as saying, because someone had asked him if there were going to be any characters of color in the game.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yoshida's answer here was, our design concept from the earliest stages of development has always heavily featured medieval Europe, incorporating historical, cultural, political, and anthropological standards that were prevalent at the time. Ultimately, we felt that while incorporating ethnic diversity into Valisthea was important, an over-incorporation into the single corner of a much larger world could end up causing a violation of those narrative boundaries we originally set for ourselves. The story we are telling is fantasy, yes, but it is also rooted in reality.
Yeah.
And I and many other people thought that that was a hell of a cop out of an answer.
Yeah, a little bit.
Because we have, we have magic, we have people turning into summoned beasts, but black people and other people of color are too much to have in the game because they're not real.
In a world that is only supposed to be influenced by real. Yeah, no, that's slightly disappointing. That
following up on that as well. After playing the game, I remember turning to people and going, it's a really good thing that characters of color weren't in this game about magical slavery, actually. Because that could have come across as very fucking bad, actually.
Yeah, no, totally.
But I don't think that going one way or the other is the right way to do it. And I don't think that his answer is an acceptable one either. Like I've done some
interesting.
Very, very basic research, and black people were very prevalent in medieval European society, actually. There's the whole kingdom of the Moors, which is in Spain. Othello, from the titular Othello, is a man of the Moors. We know historically that was used to refer to black people. The Crusades. Yep, no, I remember that very clearly from my English classes. Thank you, Mrs. Smith, wherever you are. The Crusades from 1096 up until 1453, they went all the way into the Middle East and surrounding areas. People absolutely knew what Middle Eastern people and African people looked like. There is a body known as the Ipswich Man, who is dated back from being the 1200s, and it has been definitively described as his remains being of sub-Saharan African descent. Black people existed in medieval Europe, and for him to just brush that off left such a bad taste in my mouth that it meant that months before the game's release I was going, hang on, do I really actually want to be supporting this, and is this really gonna make me angry? And the answer is yes, with a question mark at the end, because again, if you take out the magical slavery, the whole concept of 16's game really changes, and I don't really know what you could have done to tweak that other than show multiple ethnicities, within the world in similar lights or in multiple areas of life. I don't know, but Yoshida's answer was not it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, actually. It is slightly disappointing that topic of diversity was something that I've seen talked about as being one of the things that a lot of people have taken umbrage to. But I have the only thing you mentioned there that I've seen people make a claim about is it would have been bad if we had magical slaves. So if that had been the PR line from Squaresoft, and that's why they didn't bring characters like that in, but that would probably have been a bit more consistent and a little bit more, I guess, understandable than oh no, it's not real to life, because that's not true. Like you've said there. So that's.
I don't know about you either, but I at least went in not really knowing anything about 16, and I didn't really know that magical slavery of any kind was going to be such a predominant theme. I don't really think anyone did.
No,
actually.
I mean, other than my first real exposure to 16 was when I saw a trailer before a film, and then I saw loads of posters of Clive with his buff chest out on the London Underground.
That would have made the tube a bit more lively.
Change the tone somewhat. But I mean, I think, so if we talk about the 6 series, because it's an interesting one, that side of stuff. It's something to dig into, because I think if we that element of having people of color in a game about magical slavery would have been, I guess, something that could have been problematic. Now, what I think, and I'm going to make another parallel to the Game of Thrones House of the Dragon world. What's interesting about that storyline is, as we now, in this iteration of the series House of the Dragon, there is a black family, which is the Valerians, I believe they're called, or like I keep thinking of Valerian, that film with Cara Delevingne. But the Valerians, and what's interesting about Game of Thrones is that it is a story not about race, but it's about genealogy, and an important theme in certainly, again, spoilers for Game of Thrones, there's an element of the incest that goes on in the first series, and it turns out that Joffrey is actually a Lannister because it's incest between two blonde characters, and the idea is that the dominant gene of brown hair comes through, and that ties in with the narrative. It's a really important narrative. What's quite interesting about Game of Thrones is that there was a bit of an argument made about, I'm not going to point fingers at anyone in particular, but there was an argument about, hang on, you've got less people of color in this world, what's going on? And one of the arguments that came out was, well, actually, using that analogy, but then of course as time went on, the blonde characters got less and less blonde, and they stopped dyeing their hair as much. Which I remember thinking, hang on a minute, if your argument is that you've created this world around people specifically being blonde, and it's really important that they're blonde, and all of a sudden they've now got brown hair because you're too sort of lazy to dye it anymore, it's like, hang on a minute, that is similar to this, that argument doesn't stand up anymore. It's almost like, without putting words in anyone's mouth, mouth. It was almost like they were, too lazy to think about it or didn't consider it, is probably the way that would come across. Whereas it's interesting now that in House of the Dragon, they actually have the Valyrians, who are a black family, a noble family, and there's elements of that, not incest, but the sort of bastard children, that person's not their father. And the fact that there's a black character, I'm terrible with names in Game of Thrones and things like that, who is a partner and married to another character, and then the children are clearly a white character's children. Right. And it's so well done in the narrative because everyone is aware, and I think it's a lot better. Mm-hmm. The approach they've taken with that, I think, is quite interesting. Still there's nasty people saying horrible things, which they shouldn't, because everyone's got a story. And I think if they're going to wind in that back to what we said about things being realistic and truthful, these people have always existed in the world and telling the story. If we're going to go for a fully let's be representative of history, let's tell everyone's story. But if we're going to make our own fantasy world, then why can't you bring anyone in? There's no reason
especially where
not to.
People are turning into dragons and
exactly.
Women. It doesn't make sense.
If it was, I think the point I'm making with a story of excluding a certain type of person only works if that's the story you're telling. But there's nothing in this game to do you know what I mean?
There's no reason other than the reason,
a characteristic thing being part of the narrative. Is the only reason why people like that should be excluded from that particular narrative in the story design, and there's none of that in this game whatsoever. So okay, let's move on from some of that stuff and talk about some of the characters in this game, because again, I made the point out at the beginning, the understanding the characters' motivations is the most important thing in this game. So we have our main man, Clive, played by Ben Starr, who is the oldest son of the Archduke of Rosaria, and was expected to be the region's dominant. So dominant in this case is obviously the character that sort of contains or summons from them the icon or summon, but it chose his younger brother Joshua instead. What do we think of Clive as a lead character without going on for hours?
I actually enjoy Clive as
Clive.
A main character. I know I've talked before about the broody characters aren't actually as numerous as people like to make it out to be. I think Clive is appropriately broody. I think he's appropriately dryly funny as well. I think the fact that you get to see him at multiple different points in his life when he's definitely feeling different things is a very big positive in his book. And I think the fact that he is voiced by Ben Starr,
he does it so well.
It elevates him from a 10 to an 11, quite frankly, as a character.
He absolutely nails it. I mean, I think there's some excellent performances vocally in this game. There are some top vocal performances in this game.
If I complain about everything else, the one thing I'm not going to complain about is the acting.
The cast and the acting is incredible, but I think Ben Starr, again, we talked about that, transcending the game itself, the impact he's had to the greater picture of the game and the gaming world is brilliant, and that comes across in his approach to stuff and the impressions he does of stuff and stuff like that. I think he shows the growth of the character as well. It's interesting that happened over such a long period of time, 4 years. He was recording for Clive.
I think the only issue that I have with Ben's performance is that I don't think his voice was suited for the 15-year-old Clive in the prologue.
Yeah, I don't really remember that because it's so long ago since I played it. But,
it's one of those things that I just remember hearing his voice. And I was like, hang on, you're a man in your 30s. You're not 15 years old.
He acts like a 15-year-old sometimes, though, doesn't he? Let's be honest. Would you like me to collect some potatoes for you? I think he probably channels some Final Fantasy protagonists in his performance as well. There's a bit of broodiness from Squall. Final Fantasy VIII is his favourite Final Fantasy, man of taste. I think that there are some parallels to the other more brooding protagonists in this game. I think Squall in particular, but I think that you see the development quite a lot with his story, with the fact that again he's not very likable at the beginning of the story at all. When I first started playing it, I mean, performance was brilliant, but I really didn't like his character. I thought, oh God, this guy's a bit of a dick, isn't he? But then as time goes on and then you're channeling yourself through him as a character, I think it worked really, really well. And I think, that's something narratively, I think is done really, really well in this game. I think probably with the technology we have and the fact that there are so much voice acting in that adds to that. Ben's performance knocks it out of the park. I mean, we talked about I think it was the first episode, we talked about Final Fantasy VIII and the narrative choice there of having the inner thoughts with Squall, which you could see in see-through bubbles. That brought me into the game when I first played it. Actually, this is a character I felt more connected to. And of course, having voice actors within 10 helped with that as well, and having a narrative. But of course, in this sense, having a fully fledged character, I mean, it happens in a lot of games, but I think the fact that you become Clive, I think it's a testament to his performance and also the way it's served up. Next, we've got Sidolphus Tellman, Sid.
Now, that was a voice that I wasn't expecting to hear come out of Sid, but my God, does it work?
He
Ralph
does work.
Ineson does a fantastic job, and is
Man's got
very.
such a sexy voice, hasn't
He
he?
really, really does. I think one of my
I
friends
can't do an
described it
impression of
best
him.
as no, no. One of my friends described it best as like he has a voice like thunder, which
He
I don't know
does.
if it was on the casting sheet, but my God, what excellent casting!
You
It
must
was
have a voice like thunder. He turns up. He says, "Hello, you're in. You're in.
yeah.
You've won." No, he just turns up and looks at them. Nat, you're Sid. Come in.
I think
Sit
it was
down.
a few months after I'd come home from America and obviously finished Final Fantasy 16. I was at my grandmother's house and she was playing some antique restoration program. And there's a narrator on it. And I was kind of like, hang on, is that Sid?
This is Sid.
Talking, yes, it was. It's Ralph Ineson doing the voice for Salvage Hunters. That's the name of the show. And every time she watches it, I can't help. I have to leave the room just to have a little giggle. Honestly, it's fantastic.
He turns up in everything. He's in 7th or 8th Harry Potter film. He's one of the Carrows in that. He's in. He is indeed. He's in Game of Thrones. He's one of the Ironborn in Game of Thrones.
I know he's in Diablo 4 as well.
He is. He's in loads. He's great. He's bloody great.
He really is.
And you know what? Controversial opinion. I think this is the best Sid in Final Fantasy.
You know,
mic drop.
I think you might be right there.
I think he's
or
the
if
best
not,
Sid.
if not the best, then definitely in the top 3 or 2 even. I think he's a fantastic character.
The only other one that probably really rivals him is Sid from Final Fantasy VII, I think. But I think this is the best Sid. He's so good. I mean, what a character.
He's very personable, yeah.
And how he brings everyone around. Again, this is the point. Like, the reason I started liking Clive was because Sid saw something in Clive, and Sid is the linchpin for the story and the character who kind of takes on that role that I think Zidane does in Final Fantasy IX as the lead character that brings everyone round, but not being a lead character. I think is a really good sort of character story setup in that sense. That is, you're not putting yourself in his shoes directly. He is a peripheral to you because you're Clive. But no, what a character! Jill Warwick, played by Susanna Fielding.
I really liked Jill's performance, actually. Again, I liked everyone's performance.
Yeah, I'm just mentioning their names because I've been terrible historically at mentioning people's names. Yeah, see, Jill, I think I'm going to be a bit critical of Jill because I think her performance was to die for. I think Jill's design is really, really, really good. And what I think is interesting about Jill's design is it's not overtly sexual at all. It's very, I don't know what you'd call it. It's very, the word frilly comes to mind. I don't know why frilly comes to mind, but it's very
conservative, I think is probably what I describe it as.
But I mean this not in a sort of smutty way. She's a very sexy character. She's very, really? How do you put it? Yeah, I mean that in a tasteful way.
It's just something that I wouldn't have used. I think
it's the sophistication of her character, the way she's dressed, the way that she's a very together person. But I think the disappointing side of it is that she kind of becomes a prop to Clive.
Who is Jill? Because the writers certainly don't know.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah, it's very, I'll let you go first. I'll let you rant.
Now, this is not something that I necessarily got a parallel to 14, but the story of Shiva and Shiva's summoner in Final Fantasy 14 and Heavensward is, you can see very similar beats there in the Shiva and channeler of Shiva in 14 I really, really enjoy. And then the very end of that story is just so out of left field stupid and did not need to happen. And it's like, okay, so there was a sacrifice that was ultimately completely unnecessary and did nothing to change anything. Wonderful. Excellent. Okay. Jill kind of really felt like she followed that in that she had the potential to be something so much greater than she was.
Yeah, I agree.
And then I don't know what happened. Did she bonk her head or something? For my part,
bonk her head.
She was just woefully underutilized for most of the story, entirely under-emotive to the point where I'm choosing to believe that she was drowning in cortisol as a stress response for the entirety of the game, because it's the only thing that really makes sense to me. She just doesn't respond like a human would for so many different things. She doesn't even the points where the story...
Bringing out some innate...
I had problems with 16.
No, it's good. It's good. It's good. Let it all out, Mol. Let it all out. Embrace your icon, Mol.
There are points in the story where her story is obviously meant to become like front and center, the stuff where you're going to the Iron Kingdom and confronting the father there. And it's like the way that she responds to stuff only makes sense if you read her as an incredibly traumatized person just trying to keep everything on the down low, because none of her responses really, they don't scream real to me in a world where a lot of responses do. And then later clarified by the law book or the Ultimania, whatever you want to call it, she's almost given rape as a backstory, or
I didn't know about any of that stuff. Right.
Oh yeah, no. Apparently, her awakening as Shiva is because at the tender age of 13, she's brought to Father, whatever his name is, his room. He tries to touch her.
God, was that really necessary to put in as a story beat?
No,
what?
it really wasn't. It's dealt with in a manner of speaking, and it's one of those things of like in the base game they don't talk about it, and I'm fine with that. It's not something that needs to be brought up all of the time, and she gets her revenge. Whether or not I think that revenge is necessarily the right way to deal with that story is a completely irrelevant discussion. There only seems to be one way for a raper's backstory to end up going, either, or two ways rather. Either you're then the maiden who is just besmirched and depressed for the rest of her life, or you get revenge and you've overcome that issue. But like, it wasn't necessary in the first place, even if it's implied.
Yeah, totally.
It's not the only character in the game with a raper's backstory.
I didn't know this either.
Reveal.
Oh my god.
Oh no, Benedicta's whole thing. There's that flashback where I thought at least it was very heavily implied that she was at least, if not raped, then assaulted in some manner by, if not one, then many people. And two, for me, if there was supposed to be a focus on sexual violence, it would have been better, in my opinion, if the camera had actually centered its gaze on Clive. I think his experience of violence as a bearer would tie in very neatly with sexual violence. I think it would work for his characterization in a manner of, you get to see even more firsthand, I suppose, how mistreated the bearers are and how much it's had an effect on his personality, especially the scene where he's stripped naked and chained up. There was a cut scene prior to that actually happening where I believe Sid and Taya discuss like why they've stripped him, and it's so that he has nothing to hurt himself or other people with. But that's not in the final game. So what we get is a man who is completely naked and unsurprised and completely unreactive to it. It means that there is precedence for, ultimately a really dehumanizing and awful thing to happen, and he just doesn't react to it at all. I don't even think that it's a necessary inclusion whatsoever, but if it had to be included,
let's make it. I thought, and it might be just because of like the memes around that, I just thought there was an element of like, let's play this for laughs, man's naked, lol.
I would agree with that if the whole scene itself wasn't so serious. I know there's totally. One line that Sid actually makes, but even that felt so jarring to me.
I totally agree with you. I think that I'm agreeing in principle with the point you're making about it. If you're gonna make it serious, make it serious. Let's not half arse it. Hey, he's got his arse out. But like, because like nudity can be comical, by the way. I mean, this is one thing that I get a bit of a bugbear about, and people go on as soon as there's boobs anywhere, it's like, it must be sexual. It's like, well, actually, like, you can something can be comical if someone gets the kit off. There's a scene in Thor: The Dark World, which is probably not notable for anything else other than this scene, where Stellan Skarsgård's character is running around Stonehenge and he's gone mad, and you see he's running around and he's stark naked and it's censored. That's a hilariously funny scene, and you can do that with people that are butt naked. But that scene felt like it was a very serious, and all of a sudden it was like, wow, Clive's got his kit off, and it was like, right, what was that? It just
comes out of complete
thirsty people on the internet. Some of this stuff I didn't know, but I think it's probably because like a lot of it is you probably had more expectations of this game going in, and you were probably that's probably it. Whereas I think maybe my expectations were set lower.
I've definitely learned my lesson for the future. I'll put it that way.
We should always look forward to things. But I think my take on Jill, right? I liked that she was more of or they were certainly seemed to be going for she's more of a warrior type, but they didn't show very much of that. I think that was the problem. And she also came across a little bit too much of a damsel in distress at times.
Yes.
I don't really like that trope. It's tired. It's boring to me. I'd rather have, if you're gonna make her the damsel in distress, make her fully the damsel in distress. To make it a bit more. I don't know. It just felt like that they sort of started off writing her as she's going to be Clive's equal in some ways. I think what happened, I might be wrong. I've alluded to Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood in this, and in that story you have the two brothers. I've forgotten their fucking names.
Eric and Alphonse.
There we go. You've not said it and you know the names. Eric and Alphonse are the two main characters, and their childhood friend they grew up with is Winry. And Winry is the love interest of Eric. Eric? Is Eric, isn't it? Ed. There we go. Edward.
Is Eric the third lost brother?
Eric Elric. That's where it's surname's Elric. Forgive me for that.
Right.
No, Edward, Alphonse, and Winry, they grow up together. There's a romance between Winry and Edward, right? Mm-hmm. Now, Winry is a supporting character and pops in every now and then. You don't see her as much in the narrative. The narrative is obviously around the two brothers and that brotherly love section. This game clearly goes for that as well. Now, what works really well as a tertiary character or a third character to that storyline you're trying to sell, Winry's a mechanic, and she's there to help them physically and to fix things a mechanic. And now what's in this game, it feels like Jill's just there to almost be the sort of stereotype of just be the housewife is what she feels like. You know what I mean? I mean, like, there's nothing wrong with being a housewife. If you want to be a housewife, I'm not trying to have a dig at anyone that wants to do that. But I think that comes down to a problem I've got with the game as well. Let's just tangentially talk about the problem I have with the game, which is that the characters are really well acted. They're really well drawn out in most senses, but because of the fact you only play as Clive, other than Torgal a little bit, we'll talk about in a minute, you don't get any real understanding of what their class is. And what I mean by classes, I mean their character class, their job in the story.
This was something that my friends and I also discussed in the moment as well. I mean, there's this whole setup of, okay, Clive is the warrior, kind of makes sense. It's kind of shown very early on in the beginning in the prologue when you're playing as younger Joshua that he has access to healing spells. So, you know, if he's the red mage / white mage, then that makes sense. And then you look at Jill and you go, okay, are you supposed to be a black mage with your ice spells? But then you use a rapier and, you know, you're very capable. And then you look at, you know, someone like Dion, who's very obviously a dragoon. That's fine. That makes sense. You look at Sid and you go, well, what the hell are you meant to be? You dress like a 14th century Italian duelist. What are you doing?
Yeah,
it is a bit confused with its identity.
Their designs, most of them actually physically are beautiful designs.
Yes,
really cool, but it's not, they didn't quite like double down on really fleshing out what these characters' roles are. That was a problem. If you had more of an understanding of maybe Jill was more of a, I don't know, necessarily needs to be a mechanic, but more of a, because her role in the story is to be a supporting character. Right, so having have more of a job as maybe, even if it was a white mage going for the stereotype, or it was a, you know what I mean, more of a healer or something, you know, even if it was a warrior type person, it would have made more sense to probably promote that in some way. Obviously, we're just having Clive as the only character you control. It made it a bit more difficult.
I think immediately piggybacking off of that idea, actually, the most obvious place where we should, in my opinion, have someone else was the fight in, I'm pretty sure it's in the Iron Kingdom's volcano when there's that big fire person monster. It's a boss, and I think you transform into Ifrit to fight a fire monster. And all the while Shiva's in the background, and it's like, I remember that. Why are we not just playing as this? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. That would have been, I mean, maybe mechanically there was a problem with potentially bringing that in, I guess, I don't know, but like it would have made more sense to, at the very least, like controller, like you can control the characters in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, where they are, you can take control of them and choose who you want to play as and have them as a sort of, even give orders to them. You can't give orders to any other character in this game other than Torgal. You know what I mean? There's no real character dynamic. They're just there and they just do things.
Something that I also noticed, which kind of goes hand in hand with all of this as well, is there's not really any overworld banter, which made the world seem even emptier than it should have, which is such a shame, actually, because I was really looking forward to hearing what they all said to each other when they're not like confined in the hideaway, and then there's nothing. It's like, okay.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think the point I was making about Jill is that, like, I think they probably couldn't work out what they were going to do with Jill because it was like, well, actually, you know, the way we've written the theme, if they'd written it as a love story around Jill and Clive, and that was the main focus of it, it probably would have been a lot easier. But the fact they had it as a brotherly story, obviously the image that goes along with Final Fantasy 16 is the two brother icons clashing, so that's the core of the story, and anyone else around that is the peripheral. That's probably where they got a bit stuck. Because and they have been pretty good at making romance stories in the past with Final Fantasy. Obviously, we talked about 8, a clumsy romance, probably very realistic. Final Fantasy 9, a classical romance story, all done really well. And of course, that's the way those stories are focused with their main characters. 10 as well, to an extent.
Did 16's romance land for you then?
No, only at the very end. Oh my God. Like... that scene, I mean, it would be, let's pull the humor in as well. It would be really, the fact that we just said that no one really knew who Jill was, it'd be really funny to redub that scene where he goes, I love you, Jill, to who are you? That would be really funny.
I love that cruel. Every time you do your Clive voice, it sounds more and more like Batman.
Yeah, but I'm not saying it's very good, but yeah, anyway, yes.
See, for me, I really enjoyed the culmination of their romance, the scene on the beach. I thought that was actually a really, really nice culmination to an arc.
No, that's what I mean. The ending was good. The last bit, that was cool.
Everything preceding it just didn't seem to really exist.
It was good from his perspective. It's almost like, and again, acted very well. I'm not trying to I really liked that side of it. The scene on the beach, again, there's a nudity, isn't there, between the two characters, and that was done tastefully. That's what I mean. It wasn't done for humor, but it also wasn't overly sexualized. It was a romantic moment with nudity, which was really good.
Yeah, just all around strange.
But then at the end, and then the "I love you, Jill" scene was absolutely to die for.
I didn't care for that bit quite so much, actually.
I don't know. I think it's just a Final Fantasy theme playing in the background. I don't know. I think it was probably more a moment from his character where he sort of finally said how he felt, as opposed to being a bit. I liked it. I think his performance was brilliant, but the best moment in the game, though, I think, from that perspective, with the supporting character, I don't remember the name of the place, but basically Clive goes off into the hills after he's taken on all the baddies, fights through the Akashic monsters, whatever they want to call them, and then goes to fight Ultima, and he's on his own, and then everyone turns up to save him. That moment actually got me. It properly got me, because basically, like, the whole idea, that's probably the real moment. Jill's real. It would probably have been better if it had just been Jill, but Jill turns up with, I think, Dion and everyone else as well to save the day. Joshua.
I think there's someone else there.
Gav's there. Good old Gav.
Oh my god! How could I forget the best boy in the whole world?
Good old Gav. I mean, that was cool that they all turned up to help him, because the whole idea of that culmination of the story was that, which is one of the main themes of the game. It is very Final Fantasy IX, but yeah, you're not alone. But one of the moments in this game, which I think is really, really good, and this is right at the ending, was the whole, we choose how we die, we choose how we live. And the fact that Clive is stronger than Ultima because he's got friends, which is the core theme of Final Fantasy. And actually, that's done pretty well. The whole idea that Ultima has cast everyone off and doesn't care about anyone.
Yeah.
Clive
that's the thing. At the end of the day, I cannot not think of Final Fantasy XVI as anything but a Final Fantasy story, because the beats are all there. It's just not executed well enough, in my opinion.
Fair enough. I mean, I think the point is that if they'd done it where it was just Jill came and saved him, it would have redeemed her character entirely for me. That would have been amazing, because it would have been like, okay, actually now she's an equal player in this story as opposed to just the romance story. But I do think the beats, like I say, towards the end were done really, really well. I just don't think that she was woven into the narrative enough. I think, like you say, the little bits of banter and stuff like that would have probably added to it. There were moments. It was pretty good. But
there were moments, but they weren't momentous enough. Honestly, I think one of my biggest issues with 16's ending, and this is going to be both a negative and a positive, and you'll see why in a moment.
Sums the game up.
Pretty much, yeah. The entire final dungeon, which I did not particularly care for, because it's not really a dungeon, which just removes the aspect of the final dungeon. That's neither here nor there. That's not what I want to complain about.
I remember the fight.
Precisely. But Jill's not there. Jill says goodbye, and she's replaced with Best Boy Dion.
Oh god, yeah, what a fucking legend.
We'll talk more about Dion in a second.
Should have been about Dion this game, shouldn't it?
It should have been. But it was just very confusing when the entire game, like, thus far, has been Clive, Jill, and Joshua, and then all of a sudden it's the Bro Club. I was a bit like,
it was a bit weird, wasn't it? Yeah.
Okay. We've met
our quota for the women in this game. No, sorry.
Having said that, I fucking love Dion. I don't remember the last time I've loved a Final Fantasy character this much. Actually,
Dion is Kane's worthy successor, isn't he?
Yes, except less mopey in every single way.
But he takes on the mantle so fucking well. He is so fucking right. Let's go for our
Right, this is Dion moment.
The Dion talk. Dion Lesage or Lesage, is it? Let's say Stuart Clark is a voice actor.
Yes.
What a fucking performance.
What a performance.
What a fucking performance. And Dion's my favorite character. Interestingly, his voice reminded me of, I used to listen to story tapes as a kid. I was very much we used to travel quite a lot when I was a kid, and my parents got fed up of listening to Postman Pat tapes. And I was given a Sony Walkman. Sorry, I'll let you finish that.
I wasn't expecting Postman Pat.
Postman Pat should have been in this game as well, yeah. Imagine that. And he would have brought Jess, would have been his Torgal. Imagine that boss fight. That would have been amazing.
Oh, no, you couldn't go for a boss fight against Pat and Jess. You'd lose.
I wonder what Postman Pat's dominant would be.
Don't know the way you phrase
wife. Sorry. Point is that I got bought a Walkman at a very young age. Because of that, I was like, we're fed up of listening to Postman Pat in the car. Let's get Jack to listen to story tapes on his own with his headphones in. That's why I love audiobooks and listening to stuff. And there's a story, I can't remember what it is, but it's a Jack and the Beanstalk story. And the narrator of that very much reminds me of Stuart Clark's performance. It's got a very similar timbre. It's got that very like ye oldie story of. I know ye oldie's not a term. It's a very
it's a very proper way of speaking, isn't it? It's very RP.
But it's nice to listen to. It's not like I'm listening to a posh boy. It's just so silky and nice.
Yeah. No, Clark does have a wonderful voice.
Yeah. Crown Prince of the Empire of Sambrek and Dominant of Bahmut. And he's a dragoon. We've talked about that. He's also a well-written gay character.
Yes. Now, the thing that I want to highlight here, actually, and this is something that Clark has spoken about in, I think it might be multiple interviews. It might just be the one. Clark actually very specifically highlighted in one of his interviews that he was very happy to be voicing a queer character instead of a gay character.
Okay.
And I really like the fact that he used the distinction there, because we don't really know anything more about Dion. We only see him have a single on-screen romance.
I see. Sorry, right. Yeah.
We don't know anything more about his backstory. I just think it's really, really nice that, don't get me wrong, it's wonderful, like way overdue and absolutely wonderful to have an openly queer character in the Final Fantasy series anyway, and for it to be someone as well loved as Dion anyway, not just by the fans but by the narrative as well, judging by the fact that he's such a good guy. He's the light aspected prince, and he's in the final dungeon, and he has this whole redemption stuff. Like, he's very clearly a liked character. To see and this is something that Clark highlighted as well, to see so many people just really, really love him and thank him specifically for getting the chance to voice this character. Like, I know Clark has said before that he feels really honored to have been able to do that, and yeah, I think he should feel honored because he killed it. He did such a good job.
What's interesting about this, and I mean this in a positive way, when researching the characters, I'd actually forgotten that the character was gay. And I think that's actually testament to how it's written, because it's not, let's just tick a box. His character is, other than that, is so dynamic and brilliant that's
it is the way that it should be written, in
really, really good. I mean, there's obviously
important to the character, but not necessarily to the story.
And I think the reason that's the way of putting it. And the reason I've forgotten is because there's something like 60 hours of footage in this game, and remembering all the different characters' relationships and stuff like that can be really, really difficult. But of course, remembering it, of course, since I read up on it, I remembered there was the relationship between him and I forget the character's name. Terrence, that's it. That's really well put together, and it's a proper relationship. It's a really understood relationship. But also Dion's relationship with his father.
Yes.
And how he's not really accepted by his father, and how, here we go, spoiler alert, how he kills him by accident. That scene where he gives the speech in that area. And of course, what I love, and I think this is probably why I've made the Game of Thrones parallels, is that there's a point where in the game, you're obviously playing as Clive, you go on to fight Bahmut. At that point when you're fighting Bahmut, you've seen everything from Dion's perspective, and you empathize with him, and you think, wow, he's right. And then you got to go and fight him. And it's so good because you've built up this relationship with Clive and how you know what he wants, but you've got this enemy you're fighting who you see, and that is so well done. And Game of Thrones at its best had that really thing where they set the characters up where there's two people we like and they're now fighting. Oh my god, this is the first time in a game I really, really felt like that was done really, really well, where you had and morally, or I guess grey characters, because they had their own ambitions, and of course they are fighting and they are killing people, so they're clearly going to clash at some point. I didn't want to kill Dion or want to fight him as Bahmut, but boy, did I love that fight in the game. It was so good.
That was something there were a couple of points in this game where I kind of stopped and was like, this is too cool. This is too cool, actually. And the Bahmut fight was one of them. Like, the fact that
so good.
The arena is gorgeous. The music is off the charts. And then you end up in space, and it's like, the fuck is going on? What the fuck is going on? And then
Joshua comes and helps you. An interesting point we made about Jill earlier. If there'd been more of Jill coming in and helping you like that, it would have been better, wouldn't it? That's probably where there was probably a flip of a coin on what they were going to do with that, I guess. But yeah, no, that boss fight. Moving on a little bit. I mean, we mentioned that Gav was best boy. I'm not going to talk too much about Gav because he was undersold in this game, poor Gav.
Yes.
We could almost have like a different podcast just for the characters in this game, because the characters were good. Here's another one I've got written here. I want to talk about my main man, Dion. Well, I noticed you had a figure of Dion as well.
I did. He's currently the
very
only
short.
16. Yes, he's a whopping 6 inches. I counted. He's very, very small. He's a bring arts rather than a play arts or a play arts Kai, which was a little surprising. There we go. It's hit for you now.
I was just thinking of him in comparison to your other figures and what height he was at.
It's quite jarring. The closest in size is the Final Fantasy Tactics Bring Art.
His head's at crotch level.
Yeah, his head is at crotch level. I do have a Joshua on pre-order as well. They will be the only 2 16 figures that I get, unless I see another for a fantastic deal.
Live with his massive chest out on show.
I couldn't not add a Dion to my collection.
Before we move on from Dion is the most Final Fantasy feeling character in this game. Like,
I'll agree with that.
He exudes Final Fantasy. You look at him, you think he's Final Fantasy. He could have been the lead character. The story they told, I don't think it would have worked, but he could very well have been. We talked about in the last episode about Delita and Ramza and how they initially wanted to have the 2 storylines. They could very well have done this with mean, they did. They had pans away where Clive wasn't in the room and you saw things from the character's perspective. But I think this would have worked really, really well from a second game. A DLC that's just from our boy Dion's perspective would be something I would definitely buy.
I know you're not the only one. I do remember seeing
so
a
good.
lot of people wishing that the second DLC was going to be Dion focused, and then it came out and it wasn't.
Good goddamn. Oh, and he rant about the fucking DLC, right? Well, I've not played the DLC, and the reason I haven't played the fucking DLC, right, is because you must complete 5 or 6 side quests. By the way, we're not going to tell you which ones or where they are. Nah. So you download the DLC, but we're not going to let you play it unless you flipping give 5 eggs to some baker in flipping some village and go, oh, hi, I'm Clive, and I forgot my girlfriend's name. I'm really sorry. But I don't know which ones. If you just list out to me all the side quests I've got to do, then I do them. But no one's told me. I would go online. Oh, you've got to complete this side quest. I was like, well, how do I complete that side quest? And I've got to spend write a thesis on how to actually get to it. So that's my rant about the DLC. I haven't played it.
I can see that that's really annoyed you. I'm glad you've got that off your chest.
Oh God, go and give a bag of Walker's crisps to the little racist girl in town. And then while you're there, another place that pissed me off in this game, right? That flipping little town you go to. What's it called? The one in the middle of the sand area.
Dalmatia? No, not Dalmatia proper. I know the one you mean though. Yeah.
Yeah, you go and there's some really good bits in it. I think you see your uncle there, who's another fucking legend.
I fucking love Byron.
We need to have that's another podcast to talk about the secondary characters in Final Fantasy XVI. Yeah. I think it's probably the strongest part of the game. That fucking town, because it's got the typical you got a map of you're 3 foot away from where you need to go, and of course you can click. I think it's L3 or R3 or whatever, and you point towards where you need to go. But it doesn't help in this town because you need to go up 3 sets of stairs, round, up and backwards. And it's like being in some really annoying multi-story, which is just impossible to navigate through.
Do you want to know a secret, Jack?
What?
That's also from Final Fantasy XIV.
Of course it is. Yeah, see? And you're not encouraging me to play this game now. Seriously, you're trying to get me into it, and I'm like, if I'm going to have to fucking run around some town, or it says, oh yeah, it's like following a sat nav. You're 5 minutes from your destination. So okay, I'm 5 minutes from my destination, but I've got to I don't know.
It's not quite so egregious in 14, but it was something that again, both of the friends that I was playing 16 with were also 14 players, and we all just kind of collectively growed. By the way, speaking coming off the back of voice actors and Final Fantasy 14, there was one moment very, very early on in the game where me and my friends got the biggest laugh in the world. Now, you know how at the end of the prologue, when the Phoenix Gate Castle has kind of been overrun by the Sandbreak soldiers, and there's dragoons and there's all sorts. The very first dragoon that you meet, I got such a laugh out of because he has 1, maybe 2 sentences, and me and my friend sat there went, that's the dragoon from Final Fantasy XIV. And it absolutely is. It's Robert Vernon's only spoken role in all of 16, and I cracked up. And remembering it just brings me such joy.
Why is it funny? Just because it's
because he voices the main dragoon in Final Fantasy XIV.
I've just got to be in this game, guys. I've just got to be in it.
Vernon is another one like Ben Starr. Actually, he has gone on record in interviews before to say that he grew up with Final Fantasy. He's always really loved it, and he's always really loved the Dragoon class as well. So the fact that he got to voice not 1 but 2 Dragoons is you know what? Raise a glass to you,
a separate episode on all the peripheral people that are massive Final Fantasy fans. Just celebrate them. Get them on the podcast. Yeah. Okay, who's next on the character list? Barnabas Barney, played by David Menken, the King of Waloed and Dominant of Odin. Now, he kind of feels a little bit tagged on at the end, this guy, if I'm honest. I mean, I know that he supposedly worships Ultima, which is probably a point against him. He's a bit of a zealot, a religious zealot, but they've kind of gone for the trope of he's not quite in the kingdom. The kingdom he's in has probably not been part of the country kind of vibe we're going for. He's a bit out in the sticks, and he's a bit more, for want of a better term, foreign feeling because of that. Comes from a different culture. That's the vibe they're going for with him. But I think he's tagged on to the end of the game. So, very good performance, but I don't really have much more to say about him other than
that's completely understandable.
I thought that the fight with him, out of all the characters we fight in the game, he's the one I wanted dead the most because of the way that you fight him the first time and can't beat him and then have to come back to beat him again.
You hate that kind of thing, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I do hate that kind of thing. It's not right. I should be able to beat. At least we could beat him in this game. It's not like in Final Fantasy IX with Beatrix where you can't actually beat her. You should be able to fucking beat these characters. They should let you do it. Fucking upset him. They do.
See, I quite enjoyed Barnabas as a character. There was a lot of times I didn't really understand him at all, or understand what the fuck he was going on about. Again, it was kind of well, that's the thing. After a certain point, it's kind of okay, I get it. I'm just turning my ears off now. He's just
sitting there wanking off about Ultima the whole time, isn't he? Oh, he's so good. I love Ultima so much. He's my favorite.
I adored Menken's performance. I thought he
fabulous.
did an absolutely fantastic job. Again, Barnabas is one of those ones that I wish we'd had more of from the very beginning, like Ultima himself, actually. I think that would have not even necessarily upped the stakes. It just feels like it would have maybe made more of a coherent story. I wanted to like him more than I did.
Yes.
I'll put it that way.
Feels like an awful lot of the characters in this game. Hugo Kupka. What a motherfucker he is. He looks like Thanos from Infinity War, doesn't he? Dominant Titan. I wanted this motherfucker dead as well. And that fight with him was to die for. He's being quiet. Do you hate Kupka or something?
I don't really have any feelings on Kupka.
He's one-dimensional, isn't
he?
He
is, and that was something
that but I think he's done really well. I mean, I do quite like the one-dimensional villain. I mean, again, another brilliant performance is Alex Lanepekun, I believe you pronounce his name. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Not that you'll be listening, Alex, but Dominant Titan, I think that the personal vendetta between him and Clive is so well done. Like, Clive wants him dead, and by extension, you want him dead.
See, it's interesting because I wanted him dead for very, very different reasons to Clive, probably.
And that comes
to no, that's exactly it. No, Kupka was an interesting one. I could see exactly what they were trying to go for with his character, and it was one of those ones that I just don't think landed. It felt like they couldn't really decide whether they wanted to make him comic relief or if they wanted to have him serious. And for me, and again, I'm sorry to bring it back to this again, but the biggest detractor to his character, I felt, was actually Jill, because you go back to Rosaria Castle and he's there and everything is fine and dandy, and then he grabs Jill in the damsel in distress pose. He grabs her hands behind her back and then drags her off, and then you have to go and rescue her from being executed. And that was just lazily and infuriating to me that it didn't turn me off to the character so much as it turned me off for a good chunk of the game.
I can see that. I mean, I just quite like when a one-dimensional villain is performed so hammily and over the top.
I don't mind that at all, but again, if they could have decided whether or not they wanted to have him serious or
I agree with that.
I think the only other thing that I really have to note about Kupka is that I've seen a lot of people making jokes about, he loses his hands, handless, and that's a below the belt unfunny thing to say. There are people with disabilities in the world. It's one of those things of like, okay, I understand that it's kind of a human drive to like mock the characters you don't like, and Kupka is an easy one because he's there, he's, as you say, he's hammy, he doesn't know what he's really I don't know, something about it just rings very uncomfortable to me.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I think the way it's served up in the game's fine. I think that like the idea of him, his power is about his fists, and he's a big bulky man.
Don't get me wrong, within the game is fine.
Cutting his hands off is basically destroying him as a person. It's a personal vendetta with him and Clive. He's humiliating him, taking off of him what is his character essentially. But yeah, no, I've not actually seen any of that stuff about mocking it. I don't think that's necessarily an appropriate thing, is it? It's just people like that are dickheads. We've got two more that I'm going to talk about. There are obviously a lot more characters. We've not really mentioned Joshua too much.
No, we haven't. I really liked Joshua.
I
thought he was an excellent character. I liked his introduction as a child. You can see exactly like the trajectory that his life has taken looking back on him from the prologue to, the very end of the game. I really love actually that he went from being such a sweet little boy to like Valisthea's biggest bitch. Like, it's not something that he really displays, but like there's just this undercurrent of bitchiness about Joshua that I kind of really adore about him.
I see what you mean. I'm the prince.
From Annabella.
I'm the prince.
No, it's really not even that. It's just a case of, I mean, the boy was worshipped as a god by his cult members, so that's absolutely going to do something to your psyche. And then he's just so like quietly snarky in a way that doesn't really pop out all the time. You have to really be watching for it, but there are some things that he says and some lines that he delivers that is just so like, oh bitch, okay.
Yeah, no, I do. I think Joshua's cool. I think he's done really well. I
really like his design as well.
I think his design's really fabulous. He works really, really well as the counter to Clive. I think a lot of the stuff we said about Clive and it's difficult without deep diving to really go into it. But there's got some great supporting characters. There's probably one more I want to talk about specifically because then we could go on like all day about all the supporting characters. It is Annabella.
Oh,
Annabella.
Not Benedicta.
Not Benedicta, no.
Right.
Let's do Annabella and Benedicta because, yeah, she is next on the list. But I'm just looking at all these characters so we can go on for ages. Annabella, you said before, just to touch upon it, about how you reckon Annabella should have been Ultima all along. I think that would have been better. I think the scene where Clive finally meets Annabella, his mother again, is fucking fantastic. When he finally gets hold of her and he like screams at her, that's like, yes.
It was
just have her because she's a horrible person, like the worst person. And
it was very cathartic.
I think just doubling down on your point about Annabella, about how she should have been a villain all along. She fits the archetype of being a Final Fantasy villain. So, I mean, design-wise, again, she's got that kind of evil queen from Snow White vibe, right? And again, which is a generic villain, but I think looks a little bit like Ultimecia. Not with her design. Ultimecia is very flamboyant, but that kind of like, I can do what I want because I'm the queen. And yeah, if she'd been Ultima, that would have been probably would have been.
I just think it would have been such a good reveal.
Yeah, and then okay, we'll talk about Benedicta.
Benedicta is so first off, Benedicta is voiced by Nina Indus. Again, fantastic voice work, a design I really, really liked.
Yeah.
An overall vibe that I tend to really, really like, as in, like, you know, the evil lady character. I usually vibe very well with those kinds of things. Benedicta, unfortunately, is a character that the game hates for some reason. And it made me so furious that I almost wanted to stop playing before the halfway mark. Benedicta is, yes, unfortunately. I had a very, very visceral reaction, and so did one of my friends. Benedicta is a woman who is evil because she needed to be, with a question mark at the end. She doesn't really have a reason to be evil.
Woman,
you know, she can be standoffish, she can be rude. She's another one with assault as a backstory, which is just exhausting at this point. Except this time, instead of making her quiet, it drove her evil and leather wearing. And then
I just feel so bad. I've got to go on Etsy and buy some leather. Like...
Well, precisely. It's stuff that, like, it makes sense from a design perspective because they've given her the whole, like, you know, flowing with the wind and the feathers to mimic Garuda, but there's no reason for her to be the way that she is. And I wanted to really like her, and then I didn't. And the thing that really, really got to me and was the thing that nearly made me put down the game was the icon fight between Ifrit and Garuda. Because that's the first icon fight that you actually have in the game. Yeah. There are particles flying everywhere. I don't know about you, but our PS5 was struggling with some of the particle effects, so I hate to know what kind of output my computer's going to have when it finally comes to PC. But the end of that fight culminates in a way that none of the other icon fights really do. You take control with button inputs on the screen telling you to press this button and beat this woman to death with your bare hands in a way that is so intimately brutal and doesn't happen to any other icon in the game, with the exception of Joshua's head being bitten off as the Phoenix in the very beginning. But even that has a very, very different feel. It just felt
overly
very
brutal.
It was so overly brutal that, like, I stopped watching that. The immediate thing that precedes that is Benedicta's body as Benedicta, not as Garuda, being lowered to the ground, and Cid's necklace is given back to her, and the last lingering shot that you have of Benedicta is of her breasts with the necklace on top of her chest, and that was just insult to injury, to the point where the next cutscene, because there isn't a stopping point between these things, immediately after that happens is the cutscene of Bahamut versus Odin at the Battle of Belanus Tor.
Yes.
I didn't pay attention to that because I was so furious that I just didn't want any part of that game. And I think we took a break for a day or so afterwards just so I could stop being angry.
No, well, I my memory of that fight was that I played it loads and loads of times and I was really tired at night because it was the first icon fight. I was just getting used to how to do it. That's literally my memory. And I remember where I was sat playing it thinking, oh god, it's 2:00 in the morning. I need to save after this. So that's probably, I'd probably skip through it. It's probably why I didn't see that. I remember the quick time event stuff.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because actually
one of those things that really stood out to me.
I mean, I'd probably play it again. I'm surprised I didn't pick up on that because one thing I will say about the quick time events in this game is they really do bring you in to feel like you're actually taking part in the action better than probably any game I've ever experienced, because quick time events can be a bit of a novelty, but I think here the final punch of the game where you belt flipping Ultima across the face and tell him to shut up or whatever, you're really going for it. Like so actually like having you actually actively take part in beating the shit out of some woman who effectively isn't like an evil character. She just has her own.
The part where she loses control isn't even she's going crazy. She's just very overwhelmed, and she's had the only source of her power ripped from her as well. So it was very much like I don't want to label the game as misogynistic because I don't think it is. But I am very exhausted by just continual violence against women being normalized, I suppose.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think if she'd been a brawling type character and
it would have been different.
It would have made more sense. Yeah, like
it's so unnecessarily personal.
No, I totally agree with that from what you're saying. I mean, again, probably because I skipped over it because I was so tired. But But,
which I don't blame you for either. We got to a couple of points like that too.
Yes, I totally agree with you there. I think
like, and it's like we said right at the very beginning, like the highs in this game are actually pretty high, but unfortunately the lows are just so low that they really bring me out of it. And that was one of the biggest lows for me.
Again, I think the lows for me have come into the design of stuff. I think there were a bit of a miss. To me, I think the main thing, there was a little bit of, we're talking about Star Wars again. One of the things with Star Wars, for example, certainly the earlier Star Wars films, including the prequels in that, is that they like take up certain chunks of the saga of Star Wars and they start at weird points. And people have criticized them for like starting at the end of the war and not in the middle of it and things like that. The peripheral characters are probably underserved because you don't see their part of the narrative. And I think actually having a bit of DLC that talked about that character would probably alleviate some of these issues. Here's my weird take on it. If they'd swapped the dominant of Benedicta and Jill, I think it would have worked. And what I mean by that is that they would have gone full on Ice Queen with Benedicta in Shiva.
Okay.
And if they'd made Jill Garuda, they could have had the flying thing, and that would have supported my thing about being a supporting, like flying the guys in. That would have summed the problems up. Fix them both, in my opinion.
So it's so easy to fix 16 to make it a better game. That's the problem. That's the problem.
You see what I mean?
Oh, that's fantastic.
You see what I'm saying? Because that effectively then she'd be that. Again, I'm not trying to suggest that the woman should necessarily be the secondary character.
It gives a whole idea of like fanning the flames too.
See, and then she would have played against both of them because obviously Clive is the icon of fire and he's a brawling big character, and Josh was a phoenix, so she would have been like the middle ground between the two of them. There we go. Why didn't they do that? I mean, come on, Square.
Hire us, Square Enix. Hire us.
Square Enix. Yeah, we just taken a dump on you. We haven't taken a dump on the game. I like this game. But I do agree it has its problems. But I think we've probably talked enough about the characters. We could go on all day about this. If we have a quick break and then talk about some miscellaneous little stuff, we'll hopefully be a little bit more lighthearted. So what have we got left with this game? I think it's interesting to say, I think that the accessibility in this game is actually pretty good. And what I mean by that is that there are items in this game which are the timely accessories. So there are 5 of them. They're the Ring of Timely Evasion, which automatically makes you avoid attacks. The Ring of Timely Focus, which slows down time when you're about to be struck. The Ring of Timely Strikes, which executes combos with one button. The Ring of Timely Assistance, which automates Toggle, your dog's reaction. And the Ring of Timely Healing, which automatically uses potions when low on health. Now, what's interesting about this is that I think it was the Ring of Timely Strikes on for the first 25% of the game, which does all the combos for you. If you take it off, it makes the game completely different. But I think it's really interesting because actually, if you're not used to the combat system, it holds your hand, but you can turn it off. So I think that was pretty. I remember being quite impressed by how they did that. And I think I understand why, because it's the first Final Fantasy title that was a little bit more action, well, a lot more action oriented. Obviously, they flirted with it for a while, but I think that was a really good choice.
It really, the way that you could only have a certain amount. It wasn't like a toggle that you could just flip on and off, which I thought was a definite decision that they made. Again, this was one of those things where the developers themselves made comments about we don't want to make it too easy. We don't want to have a difficulty slider. And there's arguments to be made on both sides of that one, so I won't really weigh in. But it specifically reminded me of Nier Automata, actually, where you can equip the different OS chips which help you with, and I know I relied quite heavily on those when I played through Automata. Again, it was an interesting decision. I don't mind it so much. The people who do have difficulty with action games, like prolonged, I wish it had been more of an option for them to be able to toggle it. But I also understand the want from a developer to not do that for your fans. It's a difficult street to walk down.
It's always a tricky one. I just think it was clearly deliberate, which is what I liked about it. And it wasn't just a case of this is easy mode, this is hard mode. It was like I think it was more of a like, hang on a minute, this helps you with this particular aspect. I kept the I think for the entire game, I kept the automatic potions on because I am terrible with keeping myself healed, especially considering the fact you're only playing as one character. If I was playing as a party of characters, I'd have a designated healer, and I might be able to even swap that healer around. You know what I mean? But when you're playing as one person, I just want to just get in on the action and get stuck in, and I go, oh my god, my health's gone. Whoops.
And when you can't tell the AIs of the people with you to do something as well, like come on, Joshua, chop fucking chop.
Yeah.
So I think this is actually a really nice place to segue into because I don't really think we've talked about it at length. What did you think of the gameplay?
It was fine.
Just fine.
It was fine, but I think because I do quite like action RPGs. I'm a big Devil May Cry is not an action RPG; it's an action game. and I think it was comfortable. I kind of switched myself off while doing it, if that makes sense. I did like the sort of grid where you could buy more abilities and expand upon them as time went on. I quite like that. That felt very similar to Final Fantasy VII Remake, the first one, where you could kind of expand your little wave out in some respects. But when I say it was, I don't think it was bad. It was just good. It was just enough where I really like Devil May Cry, and I like being able to get stuck in and do stuff. But it wasn't like it blew my mind or anything like that. I think it was just good.
That's fair enough. Yeah, I don't think it was necessarily anything groundbreaking besides, wow, they're doing this in depth in a Final Fantasy game. But I did actually really like the ability to swap and change around like all the spells and different things that you carry into battle. I really enjoyed that part of it, actually. It makes for some really unique setups. You can play the game how you want to, which is always a big replayability factor, but also like, if one person wants to go through it as more of a mage with like Ramuh's stuff as opposed to a tank like with Titan's stuff, it gives a little bit more.
Yeah, the analogy would be in Devil May Cry 3, I think it is, you have it's the first game in the series where you can change between, you actually can call them different classes. You've got like the D-pad chooses, so you can have gunslinger, so you're more focused on using guns. They tailor your weapons and setup to be able to do different moves, very, very similar to this. The reason I'm sort of not like over the top about it is because, again, I've seen this kind of thing before. It's not done badly. It doesn't stick out as being bad or anything like that. It's a good action game, but I'm also not in the camp of I hated this. It's so different than everything I've come to expect. What I will say is that a friend of mine doesn't really like Final Fantasy style RPGs, but is a big action person. And I said, you would like this. I mean, some of it was pretty good. I mean, you can see that one of the things that was a bit weird with the discourse of this game is how shocked some people were around how action oriented it was. It's not the first Final Fantasy game to be more and more action oriented. For a while, they've been flirting with action stuff. Final Fantasy 15 was very action heavy, as was Remake. Remake had a really good balance between turn-based and not turn-based. This kind of like was a natural extension of the thread that's been put into Final Fantasy games for some time.
I think this is something we've talked about before, that every game and every battle system that tries to do something similar to what it's done in the past, it really does feel like they haven't quite gotten there as to the best version of whatever they're trying to make is yet, but they do keep improving time after time.
The staggering mechanic was, I wouldn't say perfected here, but I think the natural extension of what they've been playing with the staggering mechanic for some time. Obviously, you mentioned that it appeared first in 10.2, and then 13 and 15, it appears in some respects. Here, they kind of, I think they finally succeeded with what they wanted to do with the stagger mechanic and having it a major part of the gameplay. When I think of other Final Fantasy games, like obviously I remember the story and the story beats and how good they are, but I'm like, right, what do I want to do with this gameplay? So for example, I'd be like, do I want to go through and faff around with the junction system? Do I want to go through and move that character over there? Or what way do I want to play? With me? Because I guess I'm used to action adventure games, I'm not thinking about that. I'm just thinking about how I'm going to mash through. And if I were to play this game again, it would be to probably go through and do some of the dodgy side quests so I can play the DLC, or in a few years' time, maybe play through the story again, not because I'm really enamored by the gameplay and stuff like that, if that makes sense. Whereas like Final Fantasy 9, I'm like, well, I really want to go through and I want to go and do the Chocobo side quest and get all the weapons and then go into the tournament and see if I can get to win it. And you know what I mean? There's lots of, it's not just the story that drags me in. With this, the story drags me in, wants me want to play it again, the world makes me want to play it again, but when I'm playing it, I'm enjoying it, but it's not something I'm like, I really wouldn't mind like maxing out Sid's grid or anything like that.
Yeah.
We've flipped, so I'm the one now saying second half. Okay, so I think that kind of ties everything up. There's one more point I've got to make. There are two characters in this game that have, I think it's Greek influences.
Okay.
Characters called Ambrosia and Nectar. Do you know who Ambrosia and Nectar are?
I do, yes.
Right. So Ambrosia is the Chocobo.
Yeah.
The Chocobo was cool. I like riding the Chocobo.
Genuinely nearly cried when she's taken out by a rock at the beginning. I genuinely was like,
Ambrosia comes back.
I can do a lot of things in video games. I could do horror, I could do gore, it's not a problem. But you show Chocobos dying on screen, I'm your mortal enemy from there on.
But do you know who Nectar was?
Yes, Nectar is the Moogle that is hanging out at Sid's hideaway.
The Moogle that doesn't exist. Did you know this? It doesn't exist.
Really?
According to I think it's Hippocrates is his name. There's like a scholar that lives in Sid's hideout in this game. and you can go and find out the story beats from the scholar. Now, where this game got right, 13 and 15 didn't. 13 especially, like, is that it doesn't tell you all the story. You have to go and read up on it in little tomes and stuff like that quite a lot of the time. This game does that, but it doesn't leave out the main points from the narrative. It kind of just like has it. If you want to go in, and nothing surprises you if you read it, you can go through, you can go, oh, I already knew that, but oh, actually there's a little bit more to read up on. There's nothing important. You haven't got to go and do some homework to understand the story, but it makes the experience a bit more involved. That guy says, so one of the little girl or a little boy or something like that in the little library he's living in says, oh, can you tell us about the Moogles? And he goes, don't be stupid, Moogles don't exist. And there's a Moogle living about 10 foot away from him.
See, again, this is another kind of holdover from 14, where Moogles exist, but not everyone can see them, and some people believe they don't exist.
Well, that might be it then.
16, it's only children and Clive, so, God knows what that says about him. They can actually see.
That's the point I was going to make, is it almost feels like it's like, yeah, there's a Moogle there. Is there, Clive? Is the Moogle in the room with you now? Only Clive can see this imaginary creature. And also that Moogle kind of gives you like hunts to go on, doesn't it? That was a little bit disappointing, the hunt side of stuff. I really found it difficult to try and work out what was going on with that, where I think Final Fantasy 12 did it so well with the marks you had there, and how you could go and fight things and do extra side quests. I think that was really, really good in 12. Here, it's I remember like wanting to go out and fight a certain side quest in a certain place and not being able to find the monster. Yeah. And there was a certain like thing that needed to be done before I did it. I think that's probably my main gripe with the game.
I really hate how often that I've said this now that I'm actually saying it, but it was another holdover from 14. Hunts are pretty much exactly the same in 14, not quite to the exact scope, but you are given little like stacks of bills per, I think it's daily or weekly that you can pick them up. It gives you an approximation of somewhere in the world that you can go to find your quarry and then fight them. Again, it was one of those things where if you know where it's come from, it's just another check on the list of like, can we have something original again?
See, it works in an MMO though, because like obviously in MMOs, like you log on at the same time of day as your friend that's going to be doing a raid or something like that, and there is a trigger point for that, which is generally by something in the game, but then everyone by osmosis goes, oh, it's 4 o'clock, this is happening. In a game like this where I just want to turn it on and spend half an hour killing a monster, I don't want to have to sit around for 3 hours waiting for it to appear. That doesn't work for a single player game. That's the real frustrations. End on the negative point there, but I think overall I did enjoy my time playing it. I don't think it was the best Final Fantasy game. I think there was some excellent stuff that came out when the peripheral stuff, especially with Ben Starr's being unleashed upon the world. The way he sold the whole experience and kind of...
I feel like he did about 90% of the marketing for the game itself, honestly.
I think he kind of like being that conduit as an actual Final Fantasy fan playing the game, living the dream. So, I mean, if someone turned around to you and said, we're going to cast you as the main character in a Final Fantasy game...
I'd wet myself.
No, like... You do it.
Yeah.
Like, that would be the coolest thing in the world, but not just because you wanted to go in and sit there and act all day, because I'd enjoy that, but the point is you'd then be immortalized, wouldn't you? And the characters are I think the thing that will live on from this game. They're the interesting part.
So I have one last thing really to talk about with 16 as well, before we move on. I want to talk about the music very quickly.
Okay.
What did you think of the soundtrack?
I thought it was very good. I think the only problem I've got with it isn't because of the soundtrack's not on Spotify, so it's really difficult for me to like put it on as like a playlist for the gym or anything.
What
like
I
that.
understand, that does seem to be a consistent problem with Square Enix's. So I'm so sorry for you.
Whereas, like, I mean, to be fair, like a lot of the older ones I actually own on CD because I'm sad like that. No, actually, I'm not. That's not being sad. That's just the way I am. But no, it like having it to collect and having it to play. There aren't too many bits of music that stick out for me as being location based as brilliant. I did like the rendition of the Final Fantasy theme that plays at the end with the I Love You Jill scene. And I did like the overall bombast of the boss battles and how they bigged up and stuff like that. I think is it called something Tides, the main battle theme?
Oh god, I could. There's only a couple of names that I remember.
The battle theme where it really bombastic, it's really, really big, and then of course it settles into a little bit of a harpy piano bit, slows down. It plays a lot when you're in most battles. There's some dubstep in this game as well.
Yes.
When you fight one of the bosses, I don't remember which one it is. It throws walls at you. I can't remember which boss it is.
I remember.
Okay, go on, tell me.
So for those who are unaware, the composer, or lead composer rather, for Final Fantasy XVI is the same lead composer that has been used for Final Fantasy XIV, because CD
you said you got another one in. You got another one in. It's Final Fantasy XIV.
because CBU3 decided that they were going to shift like a good chunk of their workforce over to work on 16 at the same time as they were working on Endwalker. The lead composer is a man by the name of Masayoshi Soken, and Soken is a fantastic composer. He's won a Guinness World Record quite a long time ago now for having, I think, the most original songs in the video game. That is Final Fantasy XIV. All of his stuff is very distinctly his and very unique. All of his work is just I cannot sing his praises. If you haven't listened to the soundtrack for 14, please do yourself a favor and give it a listen. I was very disappointed in his work in 16. There are some tracks that I enjoy. There are a couple of vocal tracks which I really liked. Away, the Phoenix battle theme, and Ascension, the Bahmut battle theme. I really, really enjoyed those tracks. But for the most part, it was very bland and safe. The only thing that was really varied was the Titan tracks, which was the dubstep stuff. And again, that's kind of the first time that the music in 14 really changes and starts being a bit like, whoa, okay, this is a bit different. I enjoyed the soundtrack, of which there is a lot of, by the way. There are 191 tracks in this game, plus 8 unused tracks across 8 discs total. That is a lot of gigabyte space taken up on my iTunes. But very few of the tracks I found were actually memorable. And going into it, like going, oh, so many people are going to learn about the genius of Soken. They're going to see what a good composer he is. And then to know that a lot of people were going in expecting the next Uematsu, and then not coming away with that like fulfilled expectation. There's one streamer that I have watched for probably about 10 years now. This is Vinny of the Vinesource group on YouTube and on Twitch. I was watching his playthrough of Final Fantasy 16, and I think one of the very first things he said was like, right, what are we thinking about Soken? Do we like him? Do we not like him? And a lot of people in his chat were really amping Soken up, and he was like, appropriately excited because he trusts his chat. He was excited to hear new music, and then I think he came out of it 9 odd streams later being like, well, it was okay. And that's kind of a depressing outcome, really, for someone who I know can do so much better. It's just a little disappointing.
Fair enough. There was a few moments that were cool. I did like the vocal Final Fantasy Victory fanfare. I liked that. But yeah, nothing massively stood out to me other than that dubstep and the main battle theme. It all fit the mood of the boss music was all really good. There was no theme that I felt went with a particular area particularly well.
And that's kind of what it comes down to. It suits the game, but ultimately, in my opinion, the game was rather safe. There's the argument to be made of, well, it's M-rated, but a few fucks and a bit of side boob doesn't make a game mature necessarily. It just ups the rating. And considering how much of an impact Game of Thrones has had on the media sphere, I don't necessarily think that this was anything other than a safe game. There were definitely parts of it which jumped out as being unique, I suppose, but not particularly
groundbreaking. No, I get you. Mind you, Clive does have some fantastic side boo, doesn't he?
No. Oh, he does. That's a chest to die for, quite honestly. Yes.
All right, well, that's probably it from the Final Fantasy 16 discourse. I'm sure we could talk about it at length. It's a worthy contender. When people say it's not a Final Fantasy game, it definitely is a Final Fantasy game.
Yeah.
And there should be a Final Fantasy 16 too with Dion as the main character. Anyway, on to the wildcard topic. So what's your wildcard topic for this time then, Mol?
Today I'm going to be talking about a game which is, again, set in medieval Europe, believe it or not. I'm trying very hard to find common ground amongst all of the Final Fantasy titles that we've been talking about. Have you heard of a little game called Pentiment?
No, I haven't.
It is an adventure role-playing game developed by Obsidian Entertainment, who I'm sure you have heard of.
Yes.
Came out in 2022. It's relatively recent and it's relatively simple looking. It's got a 2D perspective. It looks like a tapestry or medieval manuscripts, which accurately fits in with everything that goes on in the game. Rather than trying its best to look graphically new and flash and fancy, it sets itself apart by being very artistic. The main character is a man called Andreas Mahler, or Mahler, it might be pronounced. He's an artist from the city of Nuremberg, and he happens to be spending what is essentially a gap year, I suppose, in a fictional town named Tassing, which I believe is set somewhere in Germany, or Upper Bavaria, I should say, for the geopolitical nerds in the audience there. While he's there, he accidentally becomes embroiled in a series of murder mysteries, which took me by such surprise when I played this game. Originally, it was one of those things that I hadn't heard of, and one of my best friends went, "Mol, you need to play this game. I will buy it for you. Just please play it." I sat
It
down.
sounds very familiar. I don't know why this sounds very familiar.
It's a lot of fun, actually. I sat down, I
Right.
played it, got quite into it, was really enjoying it. There's a few choices to be made. You can choose Andreas's background as to whether or not you want to make him like someone who was a flirt. You can make him someone who I think studied law. There's a fair amount of customization that you can make within a relatively closed adventure game. And then all of a sudden someone dies and everyone's like, well, you have to solve it. And it was like, well, what? Hang on, why me? There is no other choice but you. And boy, the choice ain't easy. It's a really, really good tale. It's not an especially long game. I think probably maybe about 15 hours to get through the entire thing. It's rather low budget, so there's not really very many animations. There's no voice acting. Do not let that influence you whatsoever, because the art style is absolutely fantastic, and there are a lot of stylistic choices within the game that actually make it feel like it's got a higher budget than it does. For example, every single character has a different script that they speak in, so to speak. So the monks in the monastery will have the heavy Latin script that you might find in the Bible, whereas someone in the town who is a peasant might only speak in what looks like handwritten writing, with plenty of spelling mistakes peppered in here and there. It's a very charming game with a very unique identity. You don't necessarily go in thinking that there's going to be any meaningful gameplay, and there isn't. It is mostly, I don't want to say point and click, but it is very similar to a point and click game.
Okay.
But ultimately, it all comes together to give you a really, really strong tale about community and legacy and how to move on when something terrible has happened. If that didn't convince you to play it, it won the best narrative at the 23rd Game Developers Choice Awards, and also in the category of interactive and immersive games at the 84th Annual Peabody Awards, which were both held in 2023.
Okay.
It's a good game. There's
critically acclaimed.
I think that's a good way to describe it. A lot of the Steam reviews actually compare it to Disco Elysium as a talking simulator rather than a walking one, which I think is probably a pretty apt description. Simulator.
It's interesting. I always like quite delving into quite artistic, different narrative approaches to stuff because it sounds very unique.
I think you'd probably really enjoy it in that case then. You can tell that it's very much a labor of love. It was very, very well researched. I think the end credits said that there's 5 people that worked on the typography alone. There are also around 30 published books and like journals on medieval life in the credits as well, so they obviously know what they're talking about. If you like your medieval European Bavarian history, or even if you know nothing about it like I did going into it, you'll probably enjoy the game. I highly recommend it, and I would like to thank my friend for buying it for
little bit of historical fiction. And I've noticed this, it's on everything as well. This looks like it is.
Yes. So very easy to access. I think it's on Steam Deck as well. So if you want to be out and about playing and introduce it,
I need to get a Steam Deck first. But no, that's cool. Thanks for that. That sounds interesting. My wildcard subject. Today, what am I talking about today? Who knows what I'm talking about today? So I'm going to talk about a bit of an interesting topic. While I was researching Final Fantasy 16, but a game that I'd heard named before popped up, which is called Bahmut Lagoon.
So you're familiar with that game as well.
You've heard of Bahmut Lagoon, and I've always wanted
anything about it.
That Lagoon, the name of it, Bahmut Lagoon. Obviously, it's Final Fantasy related. It's made by SquareSoft, or was SquareSoft at the time it was made. It's something I've always wanted to pick up and play. Now, it's very difficult to do that because it is a Japanese exclusive, annoyingly. So this game was released in 1996 by Square. So it came at a strange time in the company's and I guess gaming's history as well, because it was after Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI, which were big hits in the States, certainly, and worldwide. Chrono Trigger a little bit later, because we didn't get that till later in Europe. And they were 2D classics, and they kind of perfected the 2D formula, I think you should say. So this came out 96 when 3D was the new thing, just before Final Fantasy VII came out. So it's that weird period where we've done that 2D thing. 3D was a big thing. You had games like Tekken coming out, PlayStation was on the horizon, and it was all about, at the time, getting the arcade experience in the household, which is what Sony were pushing for very early on in the PlayStation's life cycle, which they perfected and then moved on from very quickly when the software became a thing. So this is a tactical RPG, so akin to Final Fantasy Tactics. So it's very much like a Final Fantasy Tactics prototype. It shares similarities with the Tactics Ogre games and stuff like that, but it's not 3D and isometric. It's more 2D top down. You could say it's primitive looking, but it's not unpleasing to the eye. It uses a lot of the same assets that Final Fantasy VI uses. So, and I think the premise of this is that it's unique design choices that each character in the game has like a dragon familiar character. And it's sort of like set on like the Bahmut Lagoon is like a location. It's like I want to say like a disc type world where like, all these different things are surrounding each other. And the whole idea is that each dragon has its own power and stuff like that and ties in with the individual characters. So it's a very unique title. So no, it never released outside of Japan. There was a fully fledged English localization created in 2002 by a small team, which includes, is it Clyde Mandolin? Do you know Clyde Mandolin?
That name rings a bell.
Well, I know that you've talked before about how you're into like localizations and stuff like that. But he's a professional Japanese to English translator. So been involved with lots of anime and gaming stuff. So his name may have popped up.
One of those things that I'm constantly seeing and never really registering.
Yeah, well, obviously, I think he worked on the translation for Mother 3, which is another game that was not released.
Okay.
Yeah, one of those things where, obviously back in the early days of the internet, like a lot of these games we didn't get in Europe or didn't get them in North America, so it was difficult to find like an emulated copy of the game in English. So, Mother 3 was one of those games. Final Fantasy 3 was a big one as well. The original that never got released out of, I don't know if it was made by him, but I know that was one that was a big one that was sought after by a lot of people. And Bahmut Lagoon is a bit more of an obscure title. So the updated English translation was created in 2021 by Near, a creator or a programmer called Near, who is known for their historic work on the BSNES emulator, which is a subset project of the emulation software. Hygan, I believe it's Higan, so maybe Higan or Hygan. So Near was an interesting person because they prioritized accuracy over performance to preserve history. So the Super Famicom game used to sort of test the software was a sort of title called, is it Der Langrisser? Which I don't know anything about, other than the fact that the game had bugs which appeared on the original hardware but did not appear on the emulator.
Huh, okay.
But Near wanted to like emulate the bugs, which I think is fascinating because of a preservation type thing. And then you could argue, it's better without the bugs, but actually like better is open to interpretation, isn't it? Preservation is really, really important. Of course, what else is the software not doing? So apparently Near really drove to make that sort of
that's pretty commendable, actually, from a translator.
Unfortunately, Near's no longer with us, so RIP to Near. I won't go into any more of the stories, but I'd really like to sort of celebrate their legacy, really, considering the fact that their approach has clearly been to preserve history of other stuff. It's nice to do that. Pay them the same service. There's a fabulous little subreddit as well. Now, you won't hear me say fabulous little subreddit very often because Reddit can be a toxic place. But there's an emulation of the art emulation subreddit talking about how approachable Near was as a person, and how they were very good just demystifying what seemed like difficult concepts at face value. Honestly, it's really, really worth reading if you'd like to, delve into that. And of course, talked about how they were very good at sharing time to like I say, demystify stuff. And my day job is I'm an engineer, so I'm always keen to try and explain things. There are a lot of people that would try and make things complicated when they're not. And it's always nice to hear someone that doesn't. And the really interesting thing, and this is to close things out a little bit, is that, and this I think ties in with my belief that video games can be bigger than sometimes the way they're treated certainly by mainstream press as like throwaway little things. Because the Hygan, the software that built the emulator BSNES or BSNES or whatever you want to call it, was used to help Stephen Hawking's voice machine working in the last years of his life.
Really?
It was. So I'm going to quote what Near said in 2019. And they said, in 2010, I led a fundraiser to decap coprocessors inside of game cartridges to extract their firmware. This allowed BSNES to be the first emulator to reach 100% game compatibility. In arguably the most surreal moment of my life, it turned out that one of these coprocessors, which was NEC UPD 7720, was used in Professor Stephen Hawking's voice machine. Having written the only emulator for this processor, his assistants reached out to me and I was able to donate a portion of code to their project, which was ultimately successful in replacing the original failing voice machine with a much more portable version. So that's the quote, which I think is fantastic because I think
wonderful.
It is wonderful, isn't it? It just goes to show that they were reached out to specifically, which goes to show that the people working on the software for Stephen. I mean, again, one individual, Stephen Hawking, and that technology will go on to help other people as well. It's brilliant how the project of trying to preserve a video game, which some people would throw away as being throwaway, actually leads to some stuff that actually helps people in their day-to-day life and stuff like that. I think it's great. And I think it's something that should be talked about more. That kind of thing. I love finding out stories like that because
it just goes to show that the smallest, silliest hobby that you have might really not be that small or silly after all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It impacts someone. So
yeah, definitely. And even if that someone is you, that's still incredibly important.
I totally agree. All right, anyway, so that's
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Jack.
That's it from me. Where can we find you online, Mol?
I could be found on Twitter at Adrenaline.
Yes,
and
and
what
I can also be found on Twitter at JackMullen8, and my YouTube channel is Two Random Words Productions, which I occasionally post things on.
Wonderful.
See you later.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.